Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. It rustled like cloth being smoothed over a surface. An odd sound for a room filled only with bare walls and empty shelves. I stood by the door, feeling the chill of the floor seep into my bones. The noise persisted, a gentle brushing that didn't belong in this stark space. My fingers brushed the door frame where the paint was rough and chipped. The texture transported me to a place I couldn't quite place. Flashes of a draped curtain, a hand smoothing out invisible creases. Each swish tethered me to an elusive memory, one that felt both familiar and impossibly distant. I hadn't heard that sound since I started avoiding those rooms, but it called to me unmistakably. The thing about memory is how it betrays you, not through forgetting, but through remembering things that might never have happened the way you think they did. I've been turning this over in my mind for weeks now, months maybe. The sound came first, or maybe it was the smell. Sometimes I can't tell which sense triggered the unraveling. She used to iron her clothes on the kitchen table. That's where it started, I think. The steady rhythm of the iron moving back and forth across cotton blouses, the steam rising in small puffs. The fabric would whisper against itself as she lifted and repositioned each piece. I would sit at the other end of the table, pretending to read the paper, but really watching her hands move with such careful precision. Those hands, I dream about them now. But that's getting ahead of myself, or maybe behind myself. Time doesn't seem to work the way it used to. Events fold into each other like layers of tissue paper, each one translucent enough to see through to the others beneath. The house felt different after she moved in. Not worse exactly, just charged with a kind of expectancy. Like the air before a thunderstorm when your skin prickles and you know something is coming but you can't say what. She brought her own furniture, her own rhythms. The way she arranged her books on the shelves, spines perfectly aligned. The way she folded towels into precise thirds. Everything had its place, its purpose. I started noticing things, small things, a coffee cup left in the sink when she claimed she hadn't had any coffee, footprints in the garden bed beneath the bedroom window, though she said she never walked there, the phone ringing at odd hours, the caller hanging up as soon as I answered. Maybe I was looking for problems, maybe I needed them. The first time I found the letters, I thought they were mine. Old correspondence I'd forgotten about, tucked away in a shoebox in the closet. But the handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper too fresh. They were addressed to her, but with no return address, no postmark. Just her name written in careful script across cream-colored envelopes. I didn't read them, not at first. She had a way of humming while she worked. Wordless melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, like she was channeling music from another room, another life. I'd catch myself listening for those sounds, timing my movements around the house so I could hear them without seeming to pay attention. The humming stopped around the same time I started finding other things. A receipt for gas purchased in a town I'd never heard of. A business card for a locksmith, though we'd never had trouble with our locks. A photograph of a child I didn't recognize, tucked between the pages of a cookbook. When I asked her about these things, she would look at me with such genuine confusion that I began to doubt my own observations. Maybe the receipt was old, left over from a trip she'd taken before we met. Maybe the photograph belonged to the cookbook's previous owner. Maybe I was seeing patterns where none existed. But the sound persisted, that rustling like fabric being smoothed. I heard it in the walls, in the spaces between words when we spoke to each other. It followed me from room to room, a constant whisper that seemed to say something just beyond the edge of understanding. I started keeping notes, not because I thought she was lying, but because I needed to trust my own perceptions. Small observations, recorded in a notebook I kept hidden in my desk drawer. The times she left the house, the calls she made when she thought I wasn't listening, the way her expression would change when certain songs came on the radio. Looking back at those notes now, they seem like the work of a stranger, someone obsessed with details that might mean nothing or everything. The handwriting grows more erratic as the pages progress, as if the act of recording was changing the recorder. She found the notebook eventually. I came home from work to find it open on the kitchen table, my careful observations laid bare in the afternoon light. She was sitting across from it, her hands folded in her lap, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. We didn't fight, that might have been easier. Instead, we talked in careful, measured sentences about trust and privacy and the space people need to be themselves. She explained things I hadn't thought to ask about. The gas receipt was from a weekend trip to visit a friend. The photograph was a keepsake from her previous job working with families. The business card was for a friend's recommendation in case we ever needed those services. Everything had a reasonable explanation. Everything fit together like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was trying to solve. But explanations don't change the feeling in your chest when you wake up in the middle of the night and the person next to you is breathing in a rhythm that doesn't match sleep. They don't change the way shadows fall differently when someone else is in the room, or the way your own house can feel like a place you've never been before. I stopped keeping notes, but I didn't stop noticing. If anything, the observations became more acute, more persistent. The way she would pause before answering simple questions. The way she seemed to know things about the neighborhood that I'd never told her. The way she would sometimes look at me as if she were trying to remember who I was supposed to be. The letters kept coming. I never saw them delivered, never found them in the mailbox with the rest of our mail. They would simply appear, usually on her dresser or tucked into books she was reading. Always the same cream-colored paper, always the same careful script. I did read one eventually, just one when the curiosity became unbearable. The words were innocuous enough, questions about her well-being, mentions of shared acquaintances, plans for future meetings. But there was an intimacy to the language that made my skin prickle. Not romantic intimacy exactly, something deeper and more complicated. Like the writer knew her in ways that predated language, predated explanation. The letter was signed with an initial I didn't recognize. When I asked her about it, she said it was from a cousin. Family correspondence, nothing more. She seemed hurt that I had read it, violated that I had crossed that boundary. We talked about trust again, about the importance of maintaining individual connections even within a partnership. I apologized, I meant it mostly. But the sound kept calling to me from that empty room, the rustling that shouldn't exist in a space with nothing to rustle. I would stand in the doorway, listening, trying to locate its source. Sometimes it seemed to come from the walls themselves, sometimes from the air vents, sometimes from inside my own head. She started working different hours, later nights, earlier mornings, projects that required her to travel, meetings that ran long. The house felt hollow during those times, like a shell waiting to be filled. I would walk from room to room, touching surfaces she had touched, trying to understand the geography of our shared space. In her absence, I found myself drawn to her belongings, not searching exactly, but observing. The way she organized her clothes in the closet, grouped by color and season. The books on her nightstand, always 3 or 4 at a time, bookmarked at different stages of completion. The small ceramic dish where she kept her jewelry, each piece arranged with the same careful precision she applied to everything else. I never moved anything, never disturbed the careful order she had created, but I memorized it, cataloged it, tried to read meaning in the patterns of her daily life. The photograph of the child appeared in different places, sometimes in the cookbook, sometimes tucked into a magazine, sometimes sitting on her dresser next to the letters. The child looked to be maybe 8 or 9, with dark hair and serious eyes. There was something familiar about the face, though I couldn't place what. When I asked about it again, she said it was a nephew, then later a student from her previous job, then a neighbor's child she had helped care for. The story changed, but her tone remained consistent, patient, slightly exasperated, as if she were explaining something obvious to someone who refused to understand. Maybe I was refusing to understand. Maybe understanding would have required accepting things I wasn't ready to accept. The sound grew stronger, more insistent. I would lie awake at night, listening to it move through the house like a living thing. During the day, I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, fabric settling, curtains stirring in rooms where all the windows were closed. I started avoiding certain rooms, the spare bedroom where the sound seemed strongest, the study where she kept her desk and her private papers, the basement where the rustling would echo off the concrete walls in ways that made my teeth ache. But avoidance only made the mystery more compelling. The rooms I couldn't enter became charged with possibility, pregnant with secrets I might never uncover. I would stand outside their doors, listening, wondering what I might find if I had the courage to look. She noticed my reluctance, of course, asked gentle questions about my comfort level, whether there was anything about the house that bothered me. I couldn't explain without sounding unhinged, so I made excuses about allergies, about preferring certain lighting, about old habits that were hard to break. She accepted these explanations with the same patient grace she applied to everything else, but I caught her watching me sometimes, studying my movements with an attention that felt clinical, diagnostic, like she was trying to understand a specimen that wasn't behaving according to expectations. The letters stopped coming as suddenly as they had started. I noticed their absence before I consciously realized what was missing. The house felt different, less charged. The rustling sound became intermittent, appearing only at odd moments when I was distracted by other thoughts. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt bereft, like something essential had been removed from my environment. I found myself checking the places where the letters used to appear, looking for cream-colored paper that never materialized. She seemed lighter during this period, more present, more engaged with our daily routines. We had conversations that lasted for hours, covering topics we'd never explored before. Her laugh came more easily, her touch lingered longer. It was like living with the person I thought I'd fallen in love with before the complications set in. But underneath the relief, I felt the persistent tug of unresolved questions. The photograph still appeared and disappeared. Her explanations still shifted like sand. The sound still called to me from rooms I couldn't bring myself to enter. One evening, while she was in the shower, I finally opened the door to the spare bedroom. The room was exactly as I remembered it, bare walls, empty shelves, nothing that could produce the sound I'd been hearing. But the air felt different, thicker somehow, like it was holding something I couldn't see. I stood in the doorway listening. The rustling was faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere near the far wall. I stepped into the room, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. The sound seemed to retreat as I approached, always staying just beyond my ability to locate its source. That's when I saw them, not letters this time, but photographs. Dozens of them scattered across the floor near the baseboard like someone had dropped them in haste. All of the same child, the one from the cookbook. But in these images, the child was older, the serious expression replaced by something else. Something that made my chest tighten with recognition. I was still staring at the photographs when she appeared behind me. I hadn't heard her approach, hadn't sensed her presence until she spoke my name in a voice that carried no surprise, no anger, just a kind of weary resignation. We looked at each other across the empty room, the photographs scattered between us like evidence of something neither of us wanted to name. The rustling sound had stopped completely, leaving only the silence that comes after secrets have been exposed to light. She explained, of course, patient, reasonable explanations for everything I had found, everything I had observed, everything I had questioned. The photographs were part of a project she was working on. The changing stories were attempts to protect privacy, to maintain boundaries around sensitive information. The letters had been part of a support network for families in crisis, nothing more complicated than people helping people through difficult circumstances. Everything made sense, everything fit together in ways that left no room for the doubts that had been consuming me. I should have been grateful for the clarity, for the resolution of mysteries that had been disrupting my peace for so long. But standing in that empty room, surrounded by explanations that answered every question except the ones I hadn't known how to ask, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not satisfaction, but a kind of hollow recognition, like looking into a mirror and seeing someone else's face looking back. The sound returned that night stronger than ever, but this time I recognized it for what it had always been. Not fabric rustling, not curtains moving, not any external phenomenon at all. It was the sound of my own thoughts, moving through the empty spaces in my understanding, trying to smooth out the wrinkles in a story that would never lie completely flat. I stand by the door now, feeling the chill of the floor seep into my bones. The noise persists, that gentle brushing that doesn't belong in this stark space but refuses to leave. My fingers find the doorframe, where the paint is still rough and chipped, where the texture still transports me to places I can't quite name. The rustling calls to me unmistakably. It always has, it always will. And I finally understand that the mystery was never about her, never about the letters or the photographs or the shifting explanations. It was about the sound itself, the persistent whisper of questions that have no answers, doubts that serve no purpose except to remind us that we are always fundamentally alone with our own perceptions. The room remains empty, the sound remains, and I remain here listening, waiting for something that might never come, avoiding the truth that has been staring at me from the beginning. Sometimes the most disturbing mysteries are the ones we create for ourselves, in the spaces between what we know and what we need to believe. Story 2. I stood at the kitchen's threshold, the wall clock ticking steadily above, yet the second hand refused to move. The warmth of the evening lingered, pressing against the closed windows, yet a chill wrapped around me like a shroud. The refrigerator murmured its usual hum, an unbroken rhythm that did nothing to soothe the prickling tension in the stale air. The table seemed narrower, chairs too precisely aligned, as if adjusted just so. My eyes narrowed on the clock again. It should have been reassuring, this permanence, but instead it unnerved me. Only when a draft brushed my skin, unexplained by any open window, did I notice the kitchen door swaying gently, as if caught in a breeze that shouldn't exist indoors. The door, always the door. I keep coming back to that image, the way it moved without reason. But when I try to remember what came before or after, everything becomes muddy, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. There was someone else in the house, I'm certain of that much. The way the chairs were positioned, too neat, too deliberate. Someone had been sitting there. Someone had been waiting. But who? I remember voices, fragments of conversation floating through the walls. Low murmurs that might have been the television, or might have been something else entirely. The words never quite formed properly in my memory, just the cadence of speech, the rise and fall of questions and answers. Did you hear that? Maybe I said it, maybe someone else did. The kitchen felt smaller that evening. I keep returning to this detail because it doesn't make sense. Rooms don't shrink, yet the walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. The familiar space had become foreign, like walking into a house you thought you knew only to discover the hallways had rearranged themselves. I touched the doorframe, felt the wood grain beneath my fingertips. Solid, real, but the sensation lingered strangely, as if my hand had passed through something else first, something that shouldn't have been there. The photographs on the refrigerator were crooked, all of them tilted at the same slight angle. When had that happened? I straightened one, then another, but they felt loose beneath the magnets, as if someone had been moving them, examining them. Looking for something. Or someone. There's a gap in my memory here, a space where something important should be, but isn't. I remember standing in the kitchen, and then I remember being somewhere else entirely. Upstairs, maybe, or outside. The transition is missing, cut away like a scene from a film. The next clear image is darkness, not the comfortable darkness of a familiar room at night, but something heavier, expectant, the kind of darkness that watches back. I was searching for something, a light switch maybe, or a door handle. My hands moved along walls that felt wrong, too smooth or too rough, surfaces that didn't match what should have been there. The house had become a maze of misplaced textures. Are you there? The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. It might have been my own, echoing strangely in the confined space. Or it might have been someone else, someone who had been waiting in the darkness all along. I found myself back in the kitchen. The clock still wasn't moving, its hands frozen in accusation. The refrigerator's hum had grown louder, more insistent, drowning out other sounds I might have heard, should have heard. The chairs were different now, not moved exactly, but changed somehow. As if someone had been sitting in them recently, leaving invisible impressions in the fabric. The table bore faint marks I hadn't noticed before, circular stains that might have been from glasses or cups. Evidence of a gathering I couldn't remember. I opened the refrigerator, though I'm not sure why. The light spilled out, harsh and clinical, illuminating the kitchen in stark shadows. Everything inside was exactly where it should be, yet somehow wrong, too organized, too deliberate, as if someone had been arranging things, preparing for something. The door swayed again, that same gentle motion that defied explanation. I watched it carefully this time, trying to determine what force could be moving it. The air was still, the house was still, yet the door continued its subtle dance. I approached it slowly, my footsteps echoing strangely on the linoleum. The sound was off, too hollow or too sharp. The floor itself felt uncertain beneath my feet, as if it might give way at any moment. My hand reached for the door handle, cold metal, exactly as it should be. But when I pulled it open, the space beyond wasn't what I expected. The hallway stretched too far, receding into shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Someone had been there recently. I could feel their presence like heat radiating from walls, like breath on glass. They had stood where I was standing, had seen what I was seeing. But they were gone now, or hiding. I called out, though I can't remember what I said. The words were swallowed by the house, absorbed into walls that seemed hungry for sound. No echo returned, no answer came. The silence was worse than any response would have been. I retreated to the kitchen, but it had changed again. Subtle alterations that accumulated like drops of water, each one insignificant alone, but together forming something overwhelming. The clock had moved, its hands shifted to a different position, though still frozen. The chairs had been pushed back from the table, as if someone had just stood up from a meal. A meal I couldn't remember sharing. There were dishes in the sink now, clean dishes but wet as if recently washed. I touched one, felt the lingering warmth of water that should have been cold. Someone had been here in this kitchen, performing ordinary tasks while I was elsewhere. While I was lost in those missing moments. I tried to piece together the sequence of events, but the fragments wouldn't align. The kitchen led to the hallway, which led to the darkness, which led back to the kitchen. A circle with no beginning, no end, no logical progression. The door continued its gentle swaying, hypnotic and persistent. I found myself staring at it, trying to decode its message. It was trying to tell me something, this inanimate object that moved with purpose. You know what happened. The voice was clearer this time, though I still couldn't place its source. It might have been memory, a conversation from earlier replaying in my mind, or it might have been something else, something present and immediate. I did know, somewhere beneath the confusion and the gaps, the truth was waiting. But every time I reached for it, it slipped away like smoke. The photographs on the refrigerator had moved again. Different angles now, some overlapping others, creating a collage of faces and moments I should have recognized but didn't. They looked like strangers wearing familiar expressions, people I might have known once but could no longer name. One photograph was missing. I could see the outline where it had been, a pale rectangle against the refrigerator's surface. The magnet remained, holding nothing but air and possibility. What had been in that photograph? Who had been in it? And why was it gone now? I opened drawers, searching without knowing what I sought. Utensils arranged in perfect order, as if someone had been organizing them. Everything in its place, everything exactly where it should be, yet somehow wrong. The wrongness was in the precision, the careful attention to detail. No one lived this neatly. No one arranged their kitchen with such deliberate care unless they were preparing for something. Or hiding something. The basement door was closed. I noticed this suddenly, as if the door had materialized from nothing. Had it been closed before, I couldn't remember. The handle was different from the kitchen door, older, more worn. My hand hesitated above it. Some doors shouldn't be opened. But I turned the handle anyway, felt it give way beneath my grip. The stairs descended into darkness that seemed to have weight and substance. Cool air rose from below, carrying scents I couldn't identify but somehow recognized. I didn't go down. Something in that darkness warned me away, some instinct that overrode curiosity. Instead, I closed the door and stepped back, but the image of those descending stairs remained burned in my vision. Someone had been down there recently. The air currents told me so, the way they moved and shifted. The basement wasn't empty. Back in the kitchen, the clock had started moving. The second hand jerked forward in stuttering increments, as if time itself was struggling to resume its normal flow. The sound was different now, not the steady tick I remembered, but something more urgent, more demanding. The door swayed with greater amplitude as if the invisible breeze had strengthened. I watched it carefully, timing its movements, looking for patterns. There was a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. Like the house itself was alive. The telephone rang, sharp and sudden, cutting through the refrigerator's hum and the clock's irregular ticking. I stared at it, letting it ring, afraid of what voice might emerge from the receiver. On the fourth ring, it stopped. Then it rang again. This time I answered, lifting the receiver to my ear with trembling fingers. Static greeted me, punctuated by sounds that might have been words or might have been something else entirely. In the background, I could hear breathing. It's not my own. Hello, I said, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. The breathing continued, steady and patient, waiting. I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. This time I didn't answer. I couldn't, because somewhere in that static, in those half-formed sounds, I had recognized something. A voice, perhaps, a pattern of breath I had heard before. The ringing stopped, but the silence that followed was worse, expectant, as if the caller was still there, still listening, just on the other side of the connection. I unplugged the phone. The kitchen felt smaller again, the walls pressing inward like a slowly closing fist. The door's swaying had become more pronounced, and now I could see into the hallway beyond. Shadows moved there, shifting and reforming in ways that suggested presence without revealing form. Someone was in the house. Someone had always been in the house. The realization came gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape I had been traveling through in darkness. All the signs had been there. The rearranged chairs, the clean dishes, the missing photograph, the breathing on the phone. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. But where were they? In the basement with its warning darkness, upstairs in rooms I couldn't quite remember, or here in the kitchen itself, occupying the same space but somehow invisible. The clock's hands moved backward now, unwinding the evening, returning to some earlier moment, but I remained fixed in place, unable to follow time's retreat. I was trapped in this instant, this realization, while everything else flowed around me. The door swayed toward me as if beckoning. Come closer, it seemed to say. Look more carefully, see what you've been missing. I approached, drawn by its hypnotic motion. The hallway beyond stretched into infinity, lined with doors I didn't remember, leading to rooms that might not exist. But one door was open, spilling pale light into the corridor. Light that moved like candle flame, flickering and uncertain. I could hear something now beneath the refrigerator's hum and the clock's erratic ticking. A sound like pages turning, or leaves rustling, or whispered conversations in a language I almost understood. The kitchen door swayed wider, inviting me to step through, to leave the familiar space and enter the uncertainty beyond. But I knew that once I crossed that threshold, I might never find my way back. The photographs on the refrigerator had rearranged themselves again, forming a pattern I almost recognized. Faces looking in the same direction, towards something outside the frame. Their expressions were expectant, as if waiting for someone to join them. The missing photograph's outline had grown more distinct, as if the absent image was slowly returning. I could almost see what had been there, almost remember who it had shown. Almost. The clock struck an hour that didn't exist, its chimes echoing through the house like a summons. In response, the basement door creaked open, though I was certain I had closed it. Cool air flowed upward, carrying with it the sound of footsteps on wooden stairs. Someone was coming up from the basement. Someone who had been waiting there all along. I backed toward the kitchen's far wall, but it seemed to recede before me, the room stretching to accommodate my retreat. The door continued its swaying, now in perfect rhythm with the approaching footsteps. The footsteps stopped. The house held its breath. And in that moment of perfect silence, I remembered. Not everything, not yet, but enough to understand that I had been here before in this kitchen, facing this same realization. The memory came in fragments, the swaying door, the frozen clock, the missing photograph. This had all happened before. Would happen again. The door swayed toward me one final time, and I saw myself reflected in its surface, distorted and strange. But behind my reflection, another face looked back, familiar and unknown, present and absent. The face from the missing photograph. I stood at the kitchen's threshold, watching the door sway gently in a breeze that shouldn't exist indoors. The clock above ticked steadily, but its hands remained frozen, marking a moment that refused to pass. The door, always the door. And I knew I would keep coming back to it again and again until I finally understood what it was trying to tell me, what they were all trying to tell me. The house, the photographs, the voice on the phone. The truth I kept forgetting, kept repressing, kept burying beneath layers of confusion and doubt. The door swayed, patient and persistent, holding its secrets just beyond reach, waiting for me to remember. Waiting for me to cross the threshold and discover what lay beyond. But not yet, not tonight. Tonight I would remain in the kitchen, watching the door sway, listening to the refrigerator's hum, feeling the chill that wrapped around me like a shroud. Tomorrow, perhaps, or the next day, when I was ready to remember. When I was ready to know, story 3. I told them I was just leaving, that I'd only lingered outside for a moment. They scribbled in their notebooks, satisfied with my answer. But the clinging scent of smoke lingered in my hair, and my shoes were dusted with a fine ash that trailed me like an unwanted guest. A shard of glass poked from my pocket, catching the light. The air felt heavy, holding secrets in its folds, and the quiet ticking echoed louder than it should have. My cuff was damp with something I hadn't had the heart to name. But my hands wouldn't stop trembling. The whole thing started 3 weeks earlier, or at least that's when I think it began. Memory has this way of reshaping itself, doesn't it? Like water finding new channels after a storm. I was walking past the old house on the corner, you know, the type, Victorian bones wrapped in peeling paint and neglect. The for sale sign had been there so long it had become part of the landscape, tilted at an angle that suggested resignation rather than hope. That's when I saw the smoke. Not thick billowing clouds, but thin wisps curling from an upstairs window, barely visible against the gray afternoon sky. I remember thinking someone must be inside, maybe squatters or kids playing where they shouldn't. The responsible thing would have been to call someone, but something drew me closer instead. The front gate hung open, its hinges protesting with a metallic whine that seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. The logical version of events unfolds simply enough. I approached the house, concerned about the smoke. The front door stood ajar, which struck me as odd but not alarming. Old houses settle in strange ways, and doors have been known to swing open on their own. The smell hit me as soon as I stepped onto the porch, not just smoke, but something sweeter underneath. Incense, maybe, or candles left burning too long. I called out, my voice swallowed by the empty rooms beyond the threshold. No response came back, just the settling sounds of old wood and the distant hum of traffic. I should have left then. Should have pulled out my phone and dialed the authorities. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and the house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. The interior was dimmer than expected, even with afternoon light filtering through dusty windows. Furniture stood covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts, and my footsteps on the hardwood floors created a rhythm that seemed almost musical. The smoke was stronger inside, leading me toward the back of the house where a narrow staircase curved upward into shadow. That's when I found the room. It was smaller than the others, tucked under the eaves with slanted ceilings that made it feel intimate despite the emptiness. A single candle burned on the windowsill, its flame dancing in the draft that somehow found its way through the old glass. The source of the smoke, innocent and explainable. Someone had been here recently, the candle was barely a quarter burned, and the air still held the warmth of human presence. But there were other details that didn't quite fit the neat narrative I was constructing. Scratches in the wooden floor, too deliberate to be accidental wear. A water stain on the ceiling that looked almost like a map of somewhere I couldn't name. And in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, what looked like dark spots on the baseboard. Paint, most likely, or maybe water damage from years of neglect. I blew out the candle, a practical gesture, preventing any real fire hazard, and made my way back downstairs. The whole visit couldn't have lasted more than 10 minutes. When I emerged onto the porch, the afternoon seemed brighter somehow, as if the house had been filtering the light in ways I hadn't noticed. I pulled the door closed behind me, though it didn't seem to want to latch properly, and walked back through the protesting gate. 3 weeks later, they found the body. That's when the questioning began, when notebooks appeared and my simple story of concern and curiosity suddenly needed to be examined under fluorescent lights in rooms that smelled of coffee and bureaucracy. I told them exactly what I remembered: the smoke, the concern, the brief investigation, the extinguished candle. They nodded and wrote, and I thought that would be the end of it. But memory is a strange thing. It shifts and settles like sediment in still water, and sometimes what rises to the surface isn't what you thought you'd buried there. The first crack in my certainty came that night, lying in bed and listening to the familiar sounds of my own house settling around me. I could smell smoke again, faint but persistent, as if it had woven itself into my hair and clothes more thoroughly than seemed possible from such a brief exposure. When I got up to check the windows to make sure no neighbors were burning leaves or having late barbecues, I caught sight of my reflection in the dark glass. My shirt was different than I remembered, not the blue cotton I thought I'd worn that day, but something darker. And there was a stain near the collar, small but visible, that I couldn't account for. Had I spilled coffee, cut myself shaving? The harder I tried to remember, the more the details seemed to slip away like smoke itself. The next morning brought another small disruption. While getting dressed, I found a piece of glass in my jacket pocket, not large, but sharp enough to catch the light, and pricked my finger when I pulled it out carelessly. Where had it come from? The house had old windows, certainly, and old houses are full of small hazards. I must have brushed against something, picked up this fragment without noticing. But the glass was clean, not dusty or aged like you'd expect from a long-abandoned building, but clear and bright as if it had been recently broken. And when I held it up to the window, it caught the morning sun in a way that made my eyes water and my head throb with the beginning of what would become a persistent headache. The dreams started a few days later. Not dreams exactly, but something between sleeping and waking, where the boundaries of memory became fluid and unreliable. In these half-conscious moments, I wasn't just walking through the house, I was running, not from something behind me, but towards something ahead. The narrow staircase became a tunnel, The small room under the eaves transformed into a cavern where shadows moved independently of their sources. And the candle wasn't alone on that windowsill. There were others, arranged in patterns that seemed significant but remained just beyond my understanding. The flame that had danced so innocently in my waking memory now pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and the smoke it produced didn't rise toward the ceiling but flowed downward like water, pooling in the corners and seeping through the floorboards. In these dreams that weren't quite dreams, my hands weren't steady. They shook just as they're shaking now, but not from nervousness or cold, from something else entirely. From the weight of something I was carrying, something that left my cuff damp and stained and filled the air with a metallic scent that made my stomach turn. The scratches in the floor weren't random wear patterns in this other version of events. They were deliberate marks carved with purpose and desperation. And the dark spots on the baseboard weren't paint or water damage, but something that had once been warm and vital and necessary. But these were just dreams, weren't they? Products of an imagination disturbed by questioning and doubt, by the knowledge that someone had died in that house and that I had been there, however briefly, however innocently. The mind creates patterns where none exist, finds connections in coincidence, builds elaborate structures from the flimsiest of foundations. Still, the physical evidence kept accumulating in small, troubling ways. The ash on my shoes that I hadn't noticed until the officers pointed it out, too fine to be from cigarettes or fireplaces, more like the residue of something that had burned completely. The shard of glass that I'd found in my pocket and then lost again, as if it had never existed at all. The smell of smoke that clung to my clothes despite multiple washings, as persistent as guilt. And the clock in my kitchen, the one that had kept perfect time for years, had started running slow. Not dramatically, just a minute here, 2 minutes there, but enough to make me constantly late, constantly off balance. As if time itself had been altered by whatever had happened in that house, whatever was still happening in the space between what I remembered and what I feared might be true. The breaking point came during my third interview with the investigators. They asked the same questions, received the same answers, but something in their expressions had changed. They looked at me not with the professional courtesy reserved for helpful witnesses, but with the careful attention paid to unreliable narrators. One of them, a woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to see too much, leaned forward across the metal table. "Tell us again about the candle," she said, and her voice carried an undertone that made my chest tighten. "I found it burning on the windowsill," I repeated, the words feeling rehearsed and hollow. It seemed dangerous leaving it unattended like that, so I blew it out. "Just one candle." The question hung in the air like smoke, and suddenly I wasn't sure anymore. In my memory, my daylight, logical memory, there had been one candle, simple and explainable. But underneath that certainty, another image flickered, multiple flames arranged in a circle, their light dancing across surfaces that shouldn't have been there, illuminating things that shouldn't have existed. "Yes," I said, but my voice cracked on the word. "And you were only in the house for about 10 minutes. "That's right." But even as I spoke, I could feel time stretching and contracting around me like something elastic and unreliable. 10 minutes in the bright world of rational explanation, but how long in the other version? Hours, maybe, or days, or no time at all. Time enough for things to happen that left stains on cuffs and glass in pockets and ash on shoes. Time enough for scratches to be carved and candles to be arranged, and for the careful architecture of innocence to crumble into something far more complex and disturbing. They let me go eventually, but I could feel their eyes following me as I walked to my car, could sense the weight of their suspicion settling around my shoulders like a heavy coat. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar streets that seemed somehow foreign, as if I was seeing them through different eyes or from a different angle than usual. That night I stood in my bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror, searching for signs of the person I thought I was. But the face looking back seemed like a stranger's, marked by experiences I couldn't quite remember and knowledge I didn't want to possess. My hands, when I held them up to the light, showed faint stains under the fingernails that soap couldn't seem to reach. And in the corner of the mirror, just at the edge of my vision, smoke seemed to curl and dance, carrying with it the scent of something burning and the sound of ticking that grew louder and more insistent until I had to turn away. Now sitting here in the quiet of my living room, I can hear that same ticking echoing from the walls around me. The clock on the mantel shows one time, the one in the kitchen another, and my watch has stopped entirely, its hands frozen at an hour I don't remember seeing. The shard of glass has reappeared in my pocket, sharp enough to draw blood, bright enough to catch light that isn't there. I know what they suspect, and I know what I told them. But between those two certainties lies a vast space filled with smoke and shadows, where truth bends and shifts like candlelight, and where the distance between innocence and guilt can be measured in the trembling of hands and the dampness of cuffs and the persistent scent of something burning that may never be extinguished. The house still stands on the corner, its for sale sign now supplemented by yellow tape that flutters in the wind like prayer flags. Sometimes I drive past and think I see smoke curling from the upstairs window, thin wisps against the sky that may be real or may be memory or may be something else entirely. And sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I can feel myself walking up those narrow stairs again, carrying something heavy in my hands, while candles burn in patterns I almost understand and time moves like smoke through rooms that exist only in the uncertain territory between what was and what might have been. The truth is there waiting in that space, but I'm no longer sure I want to find it. Story 4. I stood unmoving at the edge of the room, eyes fixed on the sway of the curtains that hadn't been brushed by any breeze. The clock ticked its rhythm, but the minutes felt unfocused, stretching like twilight. The whispers of the house a creak here, a distant tap there wove a fabric of unease. Each sound clung to the air longer than it should, yet revealed nothing. The space felt dense, a suspended breath held too long, waiting for release. And the silence pressed harder until subtly, a sliver of light shifted beneath the door where no light had been before. The wallpaper, that's what brings it all back now. The same faded roses, pink bleeding into cream, the pattern repeating endlessly like a prayer whispered too many times. I trace one bloom with my fingertip and feel the slight texture, the raised impression of petals that never were. This house remembers things differently than I do. Or maybe it was the photograph first, the one they showed me in that sterile room with fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly. Her face looked back at me from glossy paper, caught mid-laugh, head tilted just so. But when I close my eyes now, I can't recall if her hair was dark or light. Memory plays tricks. She lived here once, or visited often enough that her presence soaked into the walls like smoke. The detective mentioned it in passing, or maybe it was her sister who told me. Someone said she'd been staying in the upstairs bedroom, the one with the window that faces east. Morning light, they said. She liked morning light. I walk the hallway now and count my steps, 12 to reach the staircase. The wood groans under my weight, a complaint or a welcome, I can't tell which. Each step upward feels like descending into something deeper. The case file sits on my kitchen table at home, manila folder worn soft at the edges from handling. Inside, witness statements that contradict each other in small but significant ways. One neighbor heard arguing around midnight. Another swears the house was quiet until dawn. A third remembers seeing a car in the driveway, blue or maybe black, there one moment and gone the next. But here's what stays with me: the coffee cup on the kitchen counter, still warm when they found it. Half empty, lipstick stain on the rim. Whoever she was expecting never came, or came and left without finishing their drink. I found myself driving past this house for weeks before I worked up the courage to contact the owner. Something about the windows drew me, the way they reflected light during certain hours, creating the illusion of movement inside. From the street, you might think someone was home. The owner, an elderly man with careful hands and tired eyes, didn't ask many questions when I explained my interest. Said he'd been trying to rent the place for months, but people felt uncomfortable. Not because of what happened, he insisted, but because of how it happened. The not knowing. Now I understand what he meant. The bedroom upstairs smells of dust and something else, something floral but faded. Perfume, maybe, or the ghost of flowers left too long in water. The bed frame stands empty, mattress removed long ago, but the indentation in the carpet shows where it once sat. I kneel and press my palm to that spot, feeling for warmth that isn't there. In my notes from that first interview, I wrote down what the sister told me. She was careful about everything. Locked doors, checked windows twice before bed, never would have just opened the door to a stranger. But then the sister paused, looked out the window, and added something that didn't make it into my official report, unless she thought she knew them. The police found no signs of forced entry, no struggle, just the open door in her absence, as if she'd simply stepped out for air and forgotten to return. Her purse remained on the hall table, keys beside it, phone plugged into the charger by her bed, everything in its place except her. I sit on the floor of the empty bedroom and try to imagine her last evening. The routine of preparing for sleep, washing her face, brushing her teeth, maybe reading a few pages of whatever book she'd brought. The bedside lamp would have cast a warm circle of light in this room that now feels so cold. The detective assigned to the case was younger than I expected, earnest in the way that comes before experience teaches you that not every puzzle has all its pieces. He showed me photographs of the scene, clinical and stark under camera flash, but what struck me wasn't what was there, it was what wasn't. No note, no message, no sign of where she might have gone or why. People don't just vanish, he said, but his voice carried doubt. Someone always knows something. That was months ago. The investigation has gone quiet, filed away with other mysteries that resist solution. But I keep coming back to this house, walking through rooms that feel like held breath, looking for what everyone else missed. The kitchen window faces the backyard, where overgrown grass waves in patterns that suggest wind even on still days. I stand at the sink and imagine her doing the same, maybe washing that coffee cup, maybe just looking out at the morning and thinking about whatever occupied her thoughts. Normal thoughts, probably. Mundane concerns that seem precious now in their ordinariness. Her sister mentioned a man, not a boyfriend exactly, but someone she'd been seeing. Casual, nothing serious, but he'd called the house a few times. When pressed for details, the sister grew vague. Said she'd only heard one side of phone conversations, fragments that might have meant anything. She seemed nervous the last time we talked, the sister told me. Not scared exactly, but like she was waiting for something to happen. I found his name in her phone records, buried among calls to work and family and the pizza place down the street. 3 conversations in the weeks before she disappeared, each lasting less than 5 minutes. The police questioned him, of course. He had an alibi, people who could account for his whereabouts, but alibis can be constructed and people can be mistaken about times and places. When I finally tracked him down, he agreed to meet at a diner on the edge of town. Neutral ground, he said, though I hadn't asked for any particular location. He was older than I'd expected, with the kind of careful grooming that suggests vanity or insecurity. His hands shook slightly as he stirred sugar into coffee he barely touched. I barely knew her, he said, but his eyes didn't meet mine when he said it. We went out a few times, nothing serious. I was as surprised as anyone when she just disappeared. But then he mentioned something the police report hadn't included, a conversation they'd had about trust, about how hard it was to really know another person. She told him about growing up in a house where people kept secrets, where things were never quite what they seemed. She said she'd learned to read between the lines, he told me, to pay attention to what people didn't say as much as what they did. The way he said it made me wonder what she might have read between his lines. Back in the house now, I climb the stairs again and pause at the landing. There's a window here that looks out onto the street, and I imagine her standing in this same spot, perhaps watching for someone to arrive, or watching someone leave. The floorboards creak under my weight, but there's one spot near the top of the stairs that's silent. I step on it repeatedly, testing, and it never makes a sound. Someone who lived here would know which boards to avoid, how to move through the house without announcing their presence. In the police photos, there's a detail I keep returning to, a book on the nightstand, turned face down with the spine facing away from the camera. I asked the detective about it, but he couldn't remember the title. Just some novel, he said, nothing important. But everything might be important when you're trying to understand why someone vanishes without a trace. I think about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of chaos, the narratives we construct to fill in gaps that evidence can't bridge. Maybe she met someone online, someone who seemed safe but wasn't. Maybe she'd been planning to leave for weeks and just hadn't told anyone. Maybe she walked out into the night for reasons that made perfect sense to her, but would seem incomprehensible to the rest of us. Or maybe she never left at all. The basement door is locked, has been since I started coming here. The owner mentioned it once, said there'd been some water damage down there and it wasn't safe. But standing in the kitchen now, I notice something I'd missed before, scratches around the lock, fresh-looking gouges in the wood that suggest recent use. I ask myself what I'm really doing here, spending hours in a house that isn't mine, looking for traces of a woman I never met. The rational answer is that I'm researching a story following leads that might illuminate a mystery that has captured public attention. But the honest answer is more complicated. There's something about her disappearance that feels personal, though I can't explain why. Maybe it's the ordinariness of her life before that night, the way she could be any of us. Maybe it's the questions that multiply instead of resolve, the way each answer reveals new depths of not knowing. The afternoon light slants through the kitchen window, and for a moment I think I see movement in my peripheral vision. But when I turn, there's nothing there except dust motes dancing in the golden air. I've been keeping a journal of my visits to this house, noting details that might seem insignificant but could form patterns over time. The way shadows fall at different hours, the sounds the house makes when it thinks no one is listening, the feeling of being watched that comes and goes without apparent cause. Today's entry will mention the basement door and those scratches. It will also note that I found myself humming a song I don't remember learning, something with a melody that feels familiar but words I can't quite recall. She might have hummed the same tune, standing in this same kitchen, unaware that she was living her final ordinary moments. The sister called me last week. She'd been going through more of her belongings, things that had been stored in their parents' attic. Among them, a diary from several months before the disappearance. Most of the entries were routine, but one stood out. I dreamed about the house again, the same dream where I'm walking through rooms I've never seen but somehow know. There's always a door I can't open, and I wake up with the feeling that something important is waiting behind it. Dreams can be prophetic or meaningless, depending on how you choose to interpret them. But the image of a door that won't open feels significant now, standing in this house full of rooms that reveal nothing. The police searched every inch of this place, of course, checked for hidden spaces, loose floorboards, any sign that might explain what happened to her. They found nothing unusual, nothing that suggested violence or struggle, just the ordinary detritus of a life interrupted, books half-read, laundry half-folded, plans half-made. But I wonder if they looked with the right eyes. Sometimes the most important things hide in plain sight, camouflaged by their very ordinariness. The man from the diner has been calling me, not frequently, just often enough to establish a pattern. He never leaves messages, and when I answer, he claims to have dialed by mistake, but mistakes don't repeat themselves with such regularity. The last time he called, I let it ring longer than usual before picking up. When I finally answered, there was a long pause before he spoke. "Have you found anything?" he asked. "Found what?" Another pause, whatever you're looking for in that house. I hadn't told him I'd been visiting the house. The conversation ended there, but the question lingers. What am I looking for? And how does he know where I've been looking? Standing in the living room now, I try to see the space as she would have seen it that last evening. The furniture arrangement suggests someone who valued comfort over style, with chairs positioned to catch the best light for reading. A person who spent time alone and had learned to make that solitude pleasant. But there's something else, something that feels like performance. The magazines fanned just so on the coffee table, the throw pillows arranged with careful casualness, as if she'd been expecting company or wanted to create the impression of a life more curated than it actually was. The neighbors I've spoken with describe her as friendly but private. She'd wave from her car, exchange pleasantries about the weather, but never lingered for deeper conversation. One woman mentioned seeing her walking alone in the evenings, always the same route through the neighborhood, always at the same time. She had a routine, the neighbor said. Some people find comfort in routine. Or some people use routine to create the illusion of safety in a world that offers no guarantees. I've started timing my visits to coincide with those evening walks, following the route the neighbor described. It leads through quiet streets lined with houses much like this one, past a small park where children play during the day but which stands empty after dark. The loop takes exactly 23 minutes at a normal pace. On one of these walks, I noticed something the police might have missed. A section of sidewalk near the park where the concrete is newer, recently repaired. The work looks professional, but there's no city permit posted, no sign of official maintenance, just a smooth patch where something rough used to be. I kneel and run my hand over the surface. It's seamless, perfectly matched to the surrounding concrete, but something about it feels wrong. Too perfect, maybe, too carefully done. The questions multiply. Who repaired this sidewalk and when? Was it before or after her disappearance? And why does this particular spot on her regular walking route feel so important? Back at home, I spread out maps of the neighborhood and marked the locations that seemed significant. Her house, the park, the section of repaired sidewalk, the places where neighbors reported seeing her. The pattern that emerges isn't random, but it's not clear either, like a code written in a language I almost understand. The detective agreed to meet me for coffee, though he seemed reluctant to discuss the case. Too many dead ends, he said, too many questions without answers. But when I mentioned the sidewalk repair, something changed in his expression. We looked into that, he said carefully. The work was done by a private contractor, paid for in cash, no records kept. When? 2 days after she was reported missing. The timing feels significant, but significance and proof are different things. Still, I make a note to find out more about this contractor, this person who repairs sidewalks in the middle of an investigation and keeps no records of the work. The house feels different now that I know about the sidewalk. The silence seems more deliberate, the shadows more purposeful. I find myself listening for sounds that aren't there, watching for movements that never come. In the bedroom, I lie on the floor where her bed once stood and stare at the ceiling. Water stains form abstract patterns that could be anything or nothing. Clouds, maybe, or maps of places that don't exist. She would have seen these same stains during sleepless nights, might have traced the same shapes with her eyes while thinking thoughts I'll never know. The sister mentioned insomnia. She'd call sometimes at strange hours just to talk, said the house made too many noises for sleeping. But houses only make the noises we're awake to hear. Maybe she wasn't sleeping because she was listening for something specific, or someone. I've been researching the history of this house, looking for patterns that might explain the unease that settles over it like fog. The records show a succession of short-term residents, people who never stayed more than a year or two. Not unusual for a rental property, but the frequency feels excessive. One former tenant, a woman who lived here several years ago, agreed to talk with me over the phone. Her voice was careful, measured, as if she'd rehearsed what she wanted to say. There was nothing wrong with the house exactly, she told me, but I never felt comfortable there. Always had the feeling I wasn't alone, even when I knew I was. She'd moved out after finding her belongings rearranged in small but noticeable ways. A book moved from one table to another, a coffee cup in a different position. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by her own forgetfulness, but the accumulation of small changes had worn her down. I started taking pictures of rooms before I left, she said, just to prove to myself that things had moved when I came back. I asked if she still had those pictures, but she deleted them long ago. Didn't want to remember, she said. Some places are better left behind. But I can't leave this place behind, not yet. Something keeps pulling me back to these rooms, these shadows, these questions that refuse to resolve into answers. The basement door remains locked, but I've found another way to see what's down there. A window well on the side of the house provides a view into the lower level, though the glass is dirty and the angle awkward. I clean the window as best I can and peer into the darkness below. The space looks ordinary enough, concrete floor, exposed pipes, the usual detritus of storage, but there's something else, something that makes me press closer to the glass. In the far corner, barely visible in the dim light, what looks like disturbed earth. Not a hole exactly, but an area where the floor seems uneven, recently worked. I try the basement door again, testing the lock with tools I probably shouldn't have brought. The mechanism is old but solid, resistant to my amateur efforts. But the scratches around the keyhole are definitely fresh, and now I'm certain they weren't made by the owner or any legitimate repair person. Someone else has been trying to get into that basement recently. The realization should frighten me, but instead it brings a strange sense of validation. I'm not the only one who thinks this house holds secrets. Someone else is looking for answers, using methods more direct than mine. That night I drive past the house after midnight. No lights in the windows, no signs of activity, but I park across the street and watch anyway. The darkness feels alive with possibility, pregnant with secrets that daylight keeps hidden. Nothing happens for an hour, then another, but just as I'm about to leave, I see it, a brief flicker of light in the basement window, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. A flashlight, maybe, or the glow of a phone screen. Someone is in the house. I should call the police, report a break-in, let trained professionals handle whatever is happening in that basement, but something stops me. Maybe it's curiosity, or maybe it's the fear that official intervention will close off avenues of investigation I haven't finished exploring. Instead, I wait. The light doesn't appear again, but I stay in my car until dawn, watching windows that reveal nothing, listening to silence that speaks volumes. The next morning, I call the owner to ask about the basement. He's evasive, mentions the water damage again, says he's been meaning to have it properly repaired, but hasn't found the right contractor. When I press for details about the damage, he grows uncomfortable. Maybe it's time you stopped visiting the house, he says finally. I'm not sure it's healthy, all this focus on what happened there. But health and truth aren't always compatible, and I'm too deep into this mystery to surface now without answers. I contact the contractor who repaired the sidewalk, using a false name and claiming to need similar work done. The man who answers the phone has a careful way of speaking, as if he's used to questions he'd rather not answer. When I describe the location of the repair work, there's a long pause. I don't recall that particular job, he says finally. But your company did the work. I have it on good authority. We do a lot of work, can't remember every small job. But something in his voice suggests he remembers this job very well and wishes he could forget it. The pieces of this puzzle don't fit together in any conventional way, but they're starting to form a pattern of their own. A woman who disappears without explanation, a house with a history of making people uncomfortable, a basement that someone desperately wants to access, a sidewalk repaired with suspicious timing and no records kept. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a man who claims to have barely known her but can't stop calling me, can't stop asking what I've found. I decide to confront him directly. We meet at the same diner, but this time I'm prepared with questions he won't expect. I watch his face as I mention the basement, the sidewalk, the contractor who won't admit to work he clearly performed. Each detail registers in his expression like a small shock. I think you knew her better than you admitted, I say finally. I think you know what happened to her. His hands shake as he reaches for his coffee cup, and when he speaks, his voice is barely above a whisper. Some things are better left buried, he says. The choice of words feels significant, given what I saw in that basement window. What's buried, I ask. But he's already standing, already walking away, leaving me with more questions than I started with, and the growing certainty that I'm very close to something someone doesn't want me to find. That evening, I returned to the house with tools more sophisticated than my previous amateur attempts. The basement lock yields to persistence and the right equipment, and I descend into darkness that feels thick with secrets. The disturbed earth I glimpse through the window is more extensive than I realized. Someone has been digging here recently and repeatedly. The soil is loose, dark, different from the packed earth around it. I kneel and run my fingers through the dirt, feeling for anything that doesn't belong. My hand closes around something small and hard. I lift it to the light of my flashlight and see a button, silver and tarnished, the kind that might come from a coat or jacket. Ordinary in itself, but extraordinary in this context, in this place where someone has been digging in the middle of the night. I photograph the button, the disturbed earth, the basement that no one wants me to see. The images will serve as evidence, though I'm not sure yet what they're evidence of. Upstairs, the house feels different now that I've seen what it's hiding. The silence is heavier, more purposeful. The shadows seem to watch me as I move through rooms that suddenly feel less like a home and more like a crime scene. I think about her final evening in this house, about the coffee cup left half empty, the door found open, the absence that spoke louder than any presence could. Maybe she discovered what I've discovered. Maybe that's why she's gone. The button sits on my kitchen table now, next to the case file and my notes and all the questions that refuse to resolve into answers. It's such a small thing, but small things can carry enormous weight when they're found in the right place at the wrong time. I call the detective and tell him what I've found. He listens without comment, then asks me to bring everything to the station. The button, the photographs, my notes about the contractor and the man from the diner, and the basement that someone has been excavating in secret. "You shouldn't have gone down there alone," he says, but his voice carries excitement rather than reproach. "We'll need to process the scene properly, see what else might be buried there." But I already know what they'll find, or rather what they won't find. The button is significant not because of what it proves, but because of what it suggests. Someone has been removing evidence, not hiding it. The digging isn't about concealment, it's about retrieval. She's not buried in that basement. She's somewhere else entirely, and the person who put her there has been coming back to clean up traces of what happened in this house. The man from the diner doesn't answer his phone anymore. His apartment, when I drive by, looks empty. Windows dark, mail piling up, the kind of abandonment that suggests a hasty departure. But running away is its own kind of confession. The house stands empty again, yellow tape across the doors while the police process what I found in the basement. They'll excavate the entire floor, test the soil for traces of what might have been buried there, interview the contractor, and search for the man whose phone now goes straight to voicemail. I drive by sometimes, drawn by the same compulsion that brought me there in the first place. The windows reflect light in patterns that no longer suggest movement, and the silence that once felt pregnant with secrets now feels simply empty. But emptiness can be its own kind of answer. I think about her often, this woman I never met but feel I've come to know through the spaces she occupied and the questions she left behind. I imagine her discovering something in that house, something that made her dangerous to someone who thought their secrets were safely buried. Maybe she confronted him. Maybe she threatened to tell what she'd learned. Maybe that's why the coffee cup was left half empty, why the door was found open, why she vanished without taking her keys or her phone or any of the things that anchor us to our ordinary lives. The story I'm writing will never have a traditional ending because the truth resists such neat conclusions. There will be arrests, probably, trials and verdicts, and the machinery of justice grinding toward some approximation of resolution. But I'll always wonder about those final moments, about what she knew and when she knew it, about whether she had time to be afraid or if the end came too quickly for fear. The button sits in an evidence bag now, tagged and catalogued and destined for a courtroom where its significance will be debated by people who never walked through that house, never felt its silence pressing against their skin like a physical weight. I still have dreams about the basement, about digging in that dark earth and finding things that should have stayed buried. Not bodies, something more disturbing than that. Pieces of lives interrupted, fragments of stories that will never be finished. The wallpaper in my own home looks different now. Patterns that once seemed random now suggesting hidden meanings. I catch myself listening to my house the way I listen to hers, waiting for sounds that reveal more than they should. Some mysteries change us in the solving. This one changed me in the not solving, in the accumulation of questions that point toward a truth I can sense but never story 5. It began with a creak, faint but persistent, like a stubborn hinge refusing silence. My hand hovered over the dusty bookshelf, its rough surface grounding me in an unsteady room. The sound carried traces of age and neglect, echoing from the hallway, a place I hadn't ventured into for months. Yet there was something profoundly wrong. The creak belonged to another time, another house, where hallways were long and held secrets behind every door. I stood frozen, drawn inexplicably to follow the noise that shouldn't exist here. The floor beneath me seemed to remember every footstep, every attempt to forget. I hadn't heard that creak since the night it mattered. The suspicion started somewhere between the third cup of coffee and the way shadows fell across the kitchen table. Not the dramatic kind of suspicion that arrives with slamming doors or raised voices, but the quiet variety that seeps through the walls like moisture, leaving stains you don't notice until they've spread too far to ignore. I remember thinking how ordinary everything looked that morning, how the light filtered through the curtains in exactly the same pattern it had for years, yet somehow the room felt different, occupied by something that wasn't quite right. There was a photograph on the mantelpiece that had been turned slightly. Just a degree or two, nothing anyone else would notice, but I knew the precise angle it had maintained since I'd placed it there. The frame held an image of a garden party, faces blurred with laughter and summer heat, but now it seemed to be watching a different corner of the room. When I reached to straighten it, my fingers trembled against the glass, and I wondered when I had become the sort of person who noticed such minute displacements. The house had been quiet for so long that I'd forgotten how silence could carry weight. Each room held its breath, waiting for something I couldn't name. The floorboards had their own language, creaking in a rhythm that spoke of footsteps I hadn't taken, movements that occurred in the spaces between my awareness and sleep. I began to map these sounds, noting which rooms sang at which hours, trying to establish a pattern that might explain the growing certainty that I was not alone. Memory is unreliable, they say, but what about the memory of objects? The coffee cup that appeared in the sink, washed and dried, though I distinctly recalled leaving it on the counter. The book that migrated from the bedside table to the kitchen windowsill, its bookmark moved 3 chapters ahead. Small things, easily dismissed as the absent-minded shuffling of a distracted mind, yet they accumulated like evidence of a crime I couldn't quite identify. I started keeping lists, not the obvious kind, not the dramatic cataloging of a person convinced of their own persecution, but subtle notes tucked into the margins of grocery receipts and utility bills. A door left open, a lamp switched off, the subtle rearrangement of spices in the cabinet, alphabetized when I preferred them grouped by frequency of use. Each notation felt both necessary and foolish, the careful documentation of a reality that might exist only in the increasingly unreliable theater of my own perception. The neighbor's dog began barking at precisely the same time each night, a low, persistent sound that seemed directed at my bedroom window. When I finally looked outside, the animal stood perfectly still in the moonlight, its attention fixed on something behind me. I turned to follow its gaze, but the room revealed only familiar shadows and the gentle sway of curtains in a breeze I couldn't feel. There were phone calls that ended the moment I answered, not with the abrupt click of a hang-up, but with the softer sound of someone simply setting down the receiver and walking away. The silence on the other end felt occupied, breathing with a rhythm that didn't match my own. I began to anticipate these calls, my hand hovering over the phone before it rang, as if my body had learned to recognize the electrical whisper that preceded each interruption. The mailbox yielded letters addressed to no one I knew, yet they arrived with the casual regularity of expected correspondence. The envelopes bore no return address, and inside I found pages covered with handwriting that seemed familiar, though I couldn't place it. The words described ordinary events, grocery shopping, and weather observations, but they referenced places I'd never been and people I'd never met, or had I? The uncertainty gnawed at me like hunger, persistent and impossible to satisfy. I began to question the reliability of my own timeline. Had the photograph always been turned at that angle? Was the coffee cup truly misplaced, or had I simply forgotten the pattern of my own movements? The house seemed to shift around me, rearranging itself in subtle ways that left me constantly off balance, like walking on a ship in gentle seas. Everything appeared normal from a distance, but up close, the details refused to align with my memory of how things should be. The creak returned at irregular intervals, sometimes faint enough to dismiss as the settling of old wood, other times so pronounced it seemed to announce an arrival. I followed it through rooms I thought I knew, down hallways that felt longer than they should, past doorways that opened onto spaces I didn't remember. The sound led me in circles, always one step ahead, always just around the next corner. Sleep became elusive, not because of fear, but because of the growing conviction that important things happened while I wasn't watching. I would lie in bed, listening to the house breathe around me, cataloging each sound and trying to separate the familiar from the foreign. The refrigerator's hum, the tick of the heating system, the whisper of air through vents, and underneath it all, the subtle suggestion of movement, of presence, of a life being lived parallel to my own. I started leaving small tests for myself, a hair placed across a door frame, a book balanced precariously on a shelf, a glass of water filled to a precise level and marked with a pen. Each morning brought new evidence of disturbance, yet I couldn't shake the possibility that I was the one moving through the house in a state of semi-consciousness, rearranging my own carefully laid traps. The handwriting in the mysterious letters began to look more familiar, not because I recognized it as belonging to someone I knew, but because it seemed to mirror the evolution of my own script. The loops and angles shifted over time, becoming more like my own penmanship, as if whoever was writing them was learning to imitate my hand, or perhaps I was learning to write like them. The distinction became increasingly meaningless as the weeks passed and the letters continued to arrive. There were moments of clarity when the entire situation seemed absurd, when I could step back and recognize the symptoms of a mind creating patterns where none existed. But these moments of rationality felt like brief interruptions in a larger, more complex truth. The house held its secrets close, revealing them only in fragments, in the language of displaced objects and unexplained sounds. The neighbor's dog stopped barking. I realized this only after several nights of uninterrupted silence, and the absence of its nightly vigil felt more ominous than its presence had. When I looked outside, the yard next door appeared empty, overgrown, as if it had been abandoned for months. Had there ever been a dog? Had there ever been neighbors? The questions multiplied faster than I could answer them, breeding doubt in every corner of my carefully constructed reality. I began to spend more time in the hallway, the one I had avoided for so long. It stretched before me like a tunnel, lined with doors I was certain had never existed. Some stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms that defied the architecture of the house as I understood it. Others remained firmly closed, their brass handles worn smooth by hands I couldn't remember. The creak seemed strongest here, emanating from the walls themselves rather than any specific source. The photograph on the mantelpiece had turned again, now facing directly into the room, its subject seeming to observe my daily routines with the patient attention of witnesses. I no longer bothered to straighten it. Instead, I found myself studying the faces captured in that moment of summer joy, searching for clues about why this particular image had become the focus of so much subtle activity. One face in the back, partially obscured by shadow, seemed familiar in a way that made my chest tight with unexpressed recognition. Time began to fold in on itself. I would start a task in the morning and find myself completing it at dusk with no memory of the intervening hours. Meals appeared half-eaten on plates I didn't remember using. Books lay open to pages I hadn't read, their margins filled with notes in handwriting that might have been mine. The house seemed to be living my life more efficiently than I was, anticipating my needs and fulfilling them before I became conscious of them. The letters stopped arriving, but I continued to find them throughout the house, tucked between couch cushions and slipped under doors. They had evolved beyond simple descriptions of daily activities to something more intimate, more knowing. They referenced conversations I thought I'd had only with myself, described dreams I was certain I'd never shared with anyone. The handwriting had become indistinguishable from my own, as if I were corresponding with a version of myself I didn't remember being. I stood in the hallway again, my hand hovering over the dusty surface of the bookshelf, feeling the rough texture ground me in an unsteady reality. The creak had returned, faint but persistent, carrying with it the weight of all the nights I'd tried to forget. The sound belonged to this house now, had always belonged here, threading through the walls like a familiar song I'd been humming without realizing it. The floor beneath me remembered every footstep, every attempt to escape the truth that had been waiting patiently for me to stop running from it. I hadn't heard that creak since the night it mattered, but now I understood that it had never really stopped. It had simply been waiting for me to come home and listen. Story 6. The clock ticked without rhythm, each second hitching on a breath. I creased the edge of the rug with my foot, an inch further than it belonged, a reminder that time slipped in ways I couldn't measure. My reflection in the window seemed delayed, my movements out of sync, as if I watched a past self. The door, usually ajar in the afternoons, stared back, closed without memory of having shut it. The chime that should have never rung did. The sound came from somewhere deep in the house, a metallic whisper that shouldn't exist. We had removed the doorbell after the incident, pulled the wires from their housing, and left the button blank against the weathered wood. Yet the chime persisted, not quite the original tone, but close enough to make my chest tighten. I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the window, watching my breath fog the surface. The street beyond looked ordinary suburban quiet, disturbed only by the distant hum of an air conditioning unit. A child's bicycle lay on its side across the way, training wheels catching afternoon light. Normal things, safe things, things that made sense in a world where doorbells didn't ring after being disconnected. The house felt different since she left, not empty exactly, but hollowed out in places I couldn't identify. Her coffee cup still sat in the sink, the rim stained with lipstick I couldn't bring myself to wash away. The indentation of her body remained pressed into the couch cushions, a ghost of weight that my eyes insisted was still there. I found myself standing in the kitchen without remembering the walk from the living room. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, but underneath I caught something else. A scratching sound, rhythmic and deliberate. Mice, perhaps, though we had never had mice before. I opened the cabinet beneath the sink, peering into the darkness where cleaning supplies huddled together like conspirators. Nothing. The scratching stopped. My hands shook as I closed the cabinet door, not from fear but from something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The same tremor that had plagued me during those final conversations with her, when words became weapons and silence became accusation. The detective had been kind but thorough. She sat in the same chair where my wife used to read her evening book, notepad balanced on her knee, pen moving in careful strokes across the page. Her questions felt rehearsed but not insincere. How long had she been missing? When did I last see her? Had there been any arguments, any unusual behavior, any reason she might have left voluntarily? I answered honestly, or as honestly as memory allowed. Truth felt slippery those days, like trying to hold water in cupped palms. Yes, we had argued. No, not violently. Yes, she had seemed distant lately. No, I couldn't pinpoint when it started. The detective wrote everything down, her pen making soft, scratching sounds against the paper. The same rhythm I heard now from beneath the sink. I returned to the window, drawn by something I couldn't name. The child's bicycle had been moved, now propped against a mailbox instead of lying on the grass. Such a small change, barely noticeable, yet it felt significant in a way that made my stomach clench. Memory played tricks in the afternoon light. I remembered her standing at this same window, watching the street with an intensity that seemed out of proportion to suburban normalcy. When I asked what she was looking at, she would startle, as if pulled from a dream she couldn't quite shake. Nothing, she would say, just watching. But her eyes held something that looked like fear. The phone calls had started before she disappeared. Brief conversations conducted in whispers, always ending when I entered the room. She claimed they were work-related, issues with a difficult client that required delicate handling. Her explanation felt reasonable at the time, but reasonable things had a way of becoming suspicious when examined through the lens of abandonment. I opened her laptop, still sitting on the kitchen counter where she had left it. The screen came to life with a soft chime, different from the doorbell but equally unsettling. Her email showed nothing unusual. Work correspondence, promotional messages, a few exchanges with her sister about holiday plans that would never happen. But the browser history told a different story. Searches for legal aid, domestic violence resources, how to disappear without leaving a trace. The timestamps showed she had been researching for weeks, maybe months, always during the hours when I was at work. I closed the laptop, my reflection staring back from the darkened screen. The face looked familiar but wrong, like a photograph slightly out of focus. When had the lines around my eyes become so pronounced? When had my hair started thinning at the temples? When had I begun to look like someone who might drive a person to research escape routes? The detective returned the next day, or perhaps it was the same day. Time had become unreliable, stretching and contracting without warning. She brought a partner this time, a man with careful eyes who said little but noticed everything. They asked to search the house, producing a warrant with my name printed in stark black letters. I signed where they indicated, though my signature looked shaky and unfamiliar. They moved through our home with professional efficiency, photographing everything, bagging items that seemed randomly selected. A hairbrush from the bathroom, sheets from the laundry hamper, the coffee cup I had been unable to wash. "We found something interesting," the detective said, holding up a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a small recording device, no bigger than a thumb drive. This was attached to the underside of your kitchen table. I stared at the device, trying to process its implications. Someone had been listening to our conversations, documenting our arguments, recording the slow dissolution of our marriage. But who and why? "Do you recognize this?" the detective asked. I shook my head, though something about its shape seemed familiar. A gift from a conference, perhaps, or a promotional item from some long-forgotten business meeting. The kind of thing that accumulates in desk drawers until it serves an unexpected purpose. "The recordings go back several months," she continued. "Mostly mundane household conversations, but there are some heated exchanges. Arguments about money, about trust, about feeling trapped." My voice captured in digital amber, saying things I barely remembered speaking. Harsh words born from frustration and fatigue, preserved forever in silicon and shame. "We'll need you to listen to these," the detective said. "Help us understand the context." The playback sessions took place in a sterile room that smelled of industrial carpet and stale coffee. My own voice echoed from speakers, distorted by poor audio quality but unmistakably mine. Accusations and denials, threats and pleas, the soundtrack of a relationship unraveling in real time. But it was her voice that haunted me, not the words she spoke, but the fear underneath them. A tremor I had failed to notice when the conversations were happening, now magnified by the recording equipment's indifferent clarity. "Please," she said in one exchange, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need some space to think." "Space," my recorded self replied, the word dripping with contempt. "You've had plenty of space. What you need is to make a decision." I didn't remember saying that, though I couldn't deny the evidence. The voice was mine, the anger was mine, the impatience that had driven her to document our conversations in secret. The detective paused the recording. "Do you remember this argument?" I wanted to say no, but fragments were returning. A dinner that had grown cold while we fought, her tears reflecting the light from the kitchen window. The sound of her footsteps on the stairs, each step a small defeat. "She was recording us," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was a question or a statement. "The device was registered to her email address," the detective confirmed. "Purchased online about 4 months ago." 4 months I tried to trace backward, identifying the moment when trust had eroded enough to justify surveillance. But the timeline felt fluid, events shifting position depending on how I approached them. The recordings revealed patterns I had failed to recognize while living them, my voice growing sharper with each passing day, her responses becoming more guarded, more careful, as if she were already preparing for an interrogation that hadn't happened yet. "I'm scared," she said in one late-night conversation I had completely forgotten. "Of what?" my voice replied, impatient and dismissive. "Of you, of this, of what we're becoming." The recording captured my silence, stretching long enough to become its own form of response. When I finally spoke, my words were measured but cold. "If you're scared of me, maybe you should leave." Had I meant it as a challenge or a genuine suggestion? The recording offered no insight into my intentions, only the brutal clarity of words that couldn't be taken back. She left 2 days later. Or disappeared. The distinction mattered to the police, though I wasn't sure it mattered to me. Either way, she was gone, taking nothing but her purse and the clothes she wore to work that morning. Her car was found in the parking lot of a shopping center, keys still in the ignition, doors unlocked. Security footage showed her walking away from the vehicle, but the cameras lost her at the edge of the lot where shadows swallowed the sidewalk. People don't usually vanish without help, the detective said during one of our many conversations. Someone picked her up, someone she trusted. The implication hung in the air like smoke. I had become a suspect in my own wife's disappearance, though no one said so directly. The questions grew more pointed, the visits more frequent, the searches more thorough. They found her phone buried in our backyard, wrapped in a plastic bag beneath the rose bushes she had planted the previous spring. I watched through the kitchen window as they excavated the device, photographing its position before sealing it in evidence containers. I didn't put it there, I told the detective, though my protestations sounded hollow even to me. The phone was factory reset, she replied. All data wiped clean. Someone with technical knowledge did this. I worked in information technology, a fact that suddenly felt incriminating rather than innocuous. Of course, I knew how to reset a phone, how to erase digital footprints, how to make electronic evidence disappear. But I also knew that burying a wiped phone in my own backyard would be spectacularly stupid, the kind of mistake that only made sense if someone wanted the device to be found. The house grew quieter as the investigation progressed. Neighbors stopped making eye contact when I retrieved the mail. Coworkers found reasons to avoid casual conversation. I became a person-shaped hole in the community, present but not acknowledged. I found myself returning to the kitchen window, watching the street with the same intensity she had shown in those final weeks. The child's bicycle moved positions regularly now, never in the same place twice, as if someone were using it to send signals I couldn't decode. The scratching sounds beneath the sink grew more frequent, always stopping when I opened the cabinet door. I began to wonder if the sounds were real or if isolation was playing tricks with my perception. The house felt full of noises that shouldn't exist, movements in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in our bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock's irregular rhythm. The empty space beside me seemed to pulse with accusation, a void that demanded explanation I couldn't provide. The detective called on a Tuesday, or perhaps it was a Thursday. Days had lost their individual character, blending into a continuous present tense of waiting and wondering. "We need to talk," she said. "New information has come to light." The police station felt smaller than before, as if the walls had moved closer together while I wasn't looking. The detective's partner was absent, leaving us alone in the sterile interview room where my voice had been played back in endless loops. "She's alive," the detective said without preamble. "We received a call this morning. She's safe, staying with relatives in another state." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by confusion. If she was safe, why hadn't she contacted me directly? Why the elaborate disappearance, the abandoned car, the buried phone? "She doesn't want to see you," the detective continued. "She's filed for a restraining order, claims you threatened her, made her fear for her safety." The words felt disconnected from reality, puzzle pieces that didn't fit the picture I thought we were assembling. Yes, we had argued. Yes, I had been frustrated, impatient, perhaps even cruel in my dismissal of her concerns. But threats, violence, these accusations felt like descriptions of someone else's life. The recordings support her claims, the detective said. Your voice, your words, your escalating anger over several months. But recordings could be edited, context removed, conversations spliced together to create narratives that had never actually existed. I worked with digital media. I knew how easily reality could be manipulated. I never threatened her, I said, though doubt crept into my voice. Memory was proving unreliable, events shifting depending on perspective and interpretation. Listen, the detective said, activating a small device on the table between us. My voice filled the room, harsh and unfamiliar. If you don't stop this nonsense, I'll make sure you regret it. You know what I'm capable of. I had no memory of speaking those words, yet the voice was unmistakably mine. The background sounds were correct, the acoustic signature of our kitchen clearly identifiable. But the context felt wrong, the emotional texture disconnected from any argument I could recall. When was this recorded? I asked. 3 weeks before she disappeared. I stared at the device, trying to reconcile the evidence with my recollection of events. Had I really made such a blatant threat? Had my frustration truly escalated to intimidation? Or was this conversation a composite, fragments of different arguments sewn together to create a more sinister narrative? She was afraid of you, the detective said. Afraid enough to document everything, to plan her escape in secret, to stage her own disappearance rather than risk a direct confrontation. The staged disappearance made more sense now. The abandoned car was meant to suggest abduction, directing suspicion toward unknown perpetrators while she established herself safely elsewhere. The buried phone was evidence of my supposed guilt, planted where investigators would inevitably find it. But if she had orchestrated her own vanishing, why involve the police at all? Why not simply leave, file for divorce, start over in whatever distant city now sheltered her? Why create a mystery that painted me as a potential murderer? Unless she genuinely believed I was dangerous, unless her fear was real, even if my memory of inspiring that fear remained frustratingly absent. I drove home through streets that felt unfamiliar despite decades of navigation. The house looked smaller from the outside, as if it had been shrinking gradually while my attention was focused elsewhere. The windows reflected nothing, dark squares that might have been empty or might have been watching. Inside, the clock continued its irregular rhythm. I stood before it, studying the mechanism for signs of damage or interference. The pendulum swung normally, but the escapement seemed to catch occasionally, creating the hitching pattern that had become the soundtrack to my isolation. Had she damaged it before leaving? Was this another piece of evidence, another clue pointing toward my supposed guilt? Or was I reading significance into coincidence, finding patterns in chaos because the alternative was accepting that I understood nothing about my own life? The kitchen table sat exactly where it had always been, but now I couldn't look at it without imagining the recording device attached to its underside like a technological parasite. How many meals had we shared above that hidden microphone? How many intimate conversations had been captured and stored for future use against me? I pulled out the chair where she used to sit, running my fingers along the wood grain worn smooth by years of contact. Her presence lingered in the familiar scratches and stains, evidence of a shared history that felt increasingly like fiction. The evidence bag containing the recording device sat on the counter where I had left it after the police returned my property. Such a small thing to have caused such disruption. I held it up to the light, studying its simple design, wondering what other secrets it might contain. The device had been wiped clean, its memory formatted and overwritten multiple times to prevent data recovery. Professional work, the kind of thoroughness that suggested planning and technical expertise. But she wasn't technically minded, barely comfortable with basic computer functions. Someone had helped her. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape I had failed to recognize in darkness. She hadn't orchestrated this elaborate deception alone. Someone with knowledge of surveillance equipment, digital forensics, and evidence planting had guided her through the process. But who, her sister, lacked the necessary skills. Her coworkers were accountants and administrators, comfortable with spreadsheets but not espionage. Her friends were suburban neighbors whose technological sophistication peaked at social media management. Unless one of them wasn't who they appeared to be. I found myself thinking about the detective, her careful questions and professional demeanor, how quickly she had appeared after the disappearance was reported, how thoroughly she seemed to understand the technical aspects of the planted evidence, how perfectly the investigation had unfolded, each revelation building toward my inevitable guilt. But that way lay paranoia and madness. The detective was doing her job, following evidence wherever it led. If that evidence pointed toward me, the fault lay in my actions, not her investigation. I returned to the window, watching the street with new understanding. The child's bicycle had been moved again, now leaning against a fire hydrant with deliberate precision. Someone was definitely sending signals, though I remained unable to decode their meaning. A car pulled up across the street, engine running, windows tinted dark enough to obscure the occupants. It sat there for several minutes before driving away, leaving only the faint smell of exhaust and the certainty that I was being watched. The phone rang, startling me from my surveillance. The caller ID showed no information, just a number I didn't recognize. "Hello," I said, my voice sounding strange in the empty house. Silence greeted me, but not the silence of an empty line. This was occupied silence, the presence of someone listening without speaking. "I know you're there," I said. The line went dead. Within minutes, the phone rang again. Same number, same silence, same sense of being studied from a distance. I let it ring until the answering machine picked up, then listened as the caller remained on the line for nearly a minute before hanging up without leaving a message. The calls continued throughout the evening, always from different numbers but with the same pattern of silent observation. I stopped answering after the fifth call, but the ringing continued, a digital harassment that felt both random and deliberate. By midnight, the calls had stopped, replaced by a silence that felt somehow more threatening than the harassment. I sat in the dark living room, watching shadows move across the walls, listening to the house settle around me like a living thing adjusting its position. The clock's irregular ticking had become hypnotic, a broken metronome marking time that no longer seemed to flow in predictable directions. I found myself counting the hitches, looking for patterns in the mechanical stuttering. Sleep came eventually, fitful and filled with dreams of conversations I couldn't remember having. Her voice echoed through my unconscious mind, saying words that felt familiar but wrong, as if someone else's memories had been grafted onto my sleeping brain. I woke to find the front door standing open, morning light streaming across the threshold like an accusation. I had no memory of opening it, no recollection of stepping outside during the night. Yet there it was, an invitation or a warning, depending on interpretation. The street looked normal in daylight, suburban quiet disturbed only by the distant sound of a lawnmower. The child's bicycle was gone, leaving only a small impression in the grass where it had been propped. I closed the door, checking the lock mechanism for signs of tampering. Everything appeared normal, but normal had become a relative concept in a world where recording devices hid beneath kitchen tables and phones rang with silent threats. The detective called that afternoon, her voice carrying a tension that hadn't been there before. "We need to meet," she said. "There's been a development." The police station felt different this time, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. The detective's partner was back, his careful eyes more watchful than before. They sat across from me in the interview room, a file folder thick with documents between us on the table. "She's recanted," the detective said without preamble. "Claims the recordings were fabricated, that someone else was involved in planting the evidence." The words took several seconds to penetrate my understanding. Recanted, fabricated, someone else. The investigation I thought was ending was apparently just beginning. "She says you're innocent," the detective continued. "But she's also terrified, claiming that whoever really orchestrated this is still out there, still watching her." I stared at the folder, afraid to ask what new revelations it contained. If the recordings were fake, if the evidence was planted, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to frame me for a crime that hadn't actually occurred. Who, I asked, who would do this? The detective opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents I couldn't immediately identify. "That's what we're trying to determine, but we think you might be in danger too." The room seemed to tilt slightly, reality shifting to accommodate this new understanding. I wasn't a suspect anymore, but I wasn't safe either. Someone had orchestrated an elaborate deception, using both of us as unwitting actors in a drama whose purpose remained hidden. "We're going to need you to think carefully," the detective said. "Anyone who might have a grudge against you or your wife, anyone with the technical skills to create convincing audio forgeries, anyone who might benefit from destroying your marriage." But I could think of no one. We lived quiet lives, avoided conflict, maintained polite relationships with neighbors and coworkers. The idea that someone harbored enough hatred to orchestrate such an elaborate revenge seemed absurd. Yet here we were, sitting in a police interview room, discussing fabricated evidence and staged disappearances as if they were mundane occurrences rather than the stuff of paranoid fiction. The detective slid a photograph across the table. It showed a man I didn't recognize, middle-aged and unremarkable, the kind of face that would disappear in a crowd. "Do you know him?" she asked. I studied the image, searching for any flicker of recognition. Nothing. He could have been anyone, a stranger glimpsed in passing, a face from a dream I couldn't quite remember. "No," I said, "should I?" "He's been watching your house. Neighbors reported seeing him multiple times over the past several months, always in different vehicles, always careful to avoid direct surveillance, but definitely focused on your property." The child's bicycle, the moving signals I had been unable to decode. Someone had been communicating with this watcher, providing updates on my activities, my schedule, my state of mind. We think he's the one who placed the recording device, the detective continued. Probably while you were both at work, professional installation, no sign of forced entry. But that would require inside knowledge, understanding of our routines and security measures. Someone had provided detailed intelligence about our lives, someone close enough to know our habits but distant enough to avoid suspicion. The detective showed me more photographs, different angles of the same man, taken from various surveillance cameras around the neighborhood. In one image, he appeared to be talking on a phone. In another, he was studying what looked like building plans or architectural drawings. This was planned for months, she said, possibly longer. Whoever hired him wanted to be absolutely certain the frame would hold. I left the police station with more questions than answers. My status shifted from suspect to victim without any real understanding of what that meant. Someone had targeted us, but why remained a mystery wrapped in forged recordings and planted evidence. The drive home felt like traveling through a landscape that had been subtly altered while I wasn't looking. Familiar streets seemed to curve in slightly different directions. Traffic lights hung at angles that didn't match my memory. The suburban normalcy I had taken for granted revealed itself as a carefully constructed facade hiding something more sinister. The house looked the same from the outside, but I approached it with new caution. If someone had been watching for months, they knew everything about my habits, my vulnerabilities, my daily routines. The sense of being observed had become a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders like invisible hands. Inside, the clock continued its irregular rhythm, but now I wondered if the timing mechanism had been deliberately damaged. Another small act of psychological warfare, designed to create unease without obvious cause. How many other subtle alterations had been made while I was away? How many familiar objects had been moved just enough to trigger subconscious anxiety? I began a systematic examination of every room, looking for signs of intrusion or manipulation. Books slightly out of order on their shelves, furniture positioned differently than I remembered, pictures hanging at angles that seemed wrong but couldn't be definitively proven. The paranoia felt justified now, supported by evidence of genuine conspiracy rather than mere imagination. Someone had invaded our home, our privacy, our marriage, turning our own words against us through technological manipulation and careful planning. But the knowledge brought no comfort, only a deeper appreciation for how thoroughly we had been violated. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to repair even when innocence was established. The recordings might have been fake, but the emotions they captured felt real enough to leave permanent scars. I called her number, the one the detective had provided, but reached only voicemail. Her voice sounded tired, defeated, nothing like the confident woman I had married. She was safe, the message assured me, but needed time to process everything that had happened. Time, the one thing neither of us could control or recover. Months of suspicion and investigation had carved channels in our relationship that couldn't be easily filled. Even if we could identify our tormentor, even if justice was eventually served, the damage to our trust might prove irreparable. The phone rang as I was preparing for bed, but this time the caller ID showed her number. I answered quickly, desperate for connection after so much isolation. "It's me," she said, her voice small and distant. "Are you okay?" I asked, though the question felt inadequate given the circumstances. "I don't know," she replied. "I don't know anything anymore. What story 7? The weight of peaches. It hit me like a wave, the sweet, cloying scent of overripe peaches. I stopped mid-step in the hallway, the walls pressing in with the unexpected aroma. My grandmother always kept a bowl of them in the kitchen, their skins bruised and dappled under the sunlight, but here there was no place for such a fragrance. I hesitated at the threshold of the sitting room where dust gathered in the corners and the air was stale from disuse. The scent grew stronger, tugging at buried memories. It lingered in the air, cutting through the dust with an unnerving familiarity, as if daring me to remember what I'd rather forget. I couldn't shake the feeling that something long overlooked was waiting to be found. The house had been sealed for months since my aunt's death. Natural causes, they said, a heart attack in her sleep. Clean, quiet, merciful. The kind of death people wish for their loved ones. But standing there, breathing in that impossible sweetness, I wondered if we'd all been too eager to accept the simple explanation. My fingers traced the doorframe as I stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under my weight, each sound sharp in the oppressive silence. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, casting long shadows across furniture draped in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. Everything appeared untouched, preserved in the amber of abandonment. I moved toward the mantelpiece where family photographs stood in tarnished frames. My aunt's face smiled back at me from various stages of her life, but something about her expression in the most recent photo seemed strained. Her eyes held a tension I hadn't noticed before, a wariness that didn't match her practiced smile. The photographer had captured something she might not have intended to reveal. The scent of peaches grew overwhelming near the bookshelf. I ran my hands along the spines, feeling the accumulated dust coat my fingertips. Most were romance novels and gardening guides, but wedged between them was a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before. The cover was worn smooth by handling, the edges darkened with age and oils from human touch. Inside, my aunt's careful handwriting filled page after page. The entries began innocuously enough, documenting daily activities and weather patterns. But as I read deeper, a different narrative emerged. She wrote about feeling watched, about phone calls that ended when she answered, about finding her garden gate open in the morning when she was certain she'd latched it the night before. One entry made my breath catch. She described the same peach scent I was experiencing now, appearing in rooms where it had no business being. She attributed it to memory, to grief over her mother's passing, to the mind's tendency to conjure comfort in times of stress. But her handwriting grew more agitated with each mention. The letters pressed deeper into the paper as if urgency could make her words more real. I sank into the wingback chair where she used to sit for her evening reading. The fabric still held the faint impression of her body, a hollow that had molded to her shape over countless hours. From this vantage point, I could see the kitchen through the doorway, the counter where she would have prepared her final meal, the table where she ate alone, as she had for so many years since her husband's death. The journal revealed she hadn't been eating well in those final weeks. Sleep eluded her. She wrote about hearing footsteps in the attic, about doors that stood slightly ajar when she was sure she'd closed them. Her doctor had suggested anxiety medication, attributing her concerns to the natural paranoia that sometimes accompanies aging and isolation. She'd refused, insisting her mind was sharp, that what she experienced was real. I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about her death. The paramedics had arrived to find her peaceful in bed, no signs of struggle or distress. The autopsy confirmed heart failure, nothing suspicious. Case closed, family notified, funeral arrangements made. We'd all moved through the motions of grief and acceptance without pause for deeper examination. But the journal painted a different picture. In her final entries, she wrote about a neighbor who'd taken an unusual interest in her daily routines. Someone who asked too many questions about her schedule, who seemed to know when she'd been away from home. She never named this person directly, referring only to the one who watches and the one who knows too much. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. The handwriting became increasingly erratic, words sometimes trailing off mid-sentence or pressed so hard into the paper they tore through. She wrote about finding her spare key moved from its hiding place, about discovering muddy footprints on her back porch after rain, about the growing certainty that someone had been inside her house while she slept. The final entry was brief, written in shaky letters that barely resembled her usual careful script. She'd hidden something, she wrote, something that would explain everything if anything happened to her. She'd put it where only family would think to look, in a place that held meaning for those who truly knew her. I closed the journal and sat in the gathering twilight trying to process what I'd read. The sweet scent of peaches had faded, replaced by the musty smell of a house too long without inhabitants. But I could still taste it in the back of my throat, that cloying sweetness that had drawn me to this discovery. Rising from the chair, I began a systematic search of the rooms. I looked behind picture frames, inside book covers, under loose floorboards. I checked the spaces where my aunt might have secreted something away from prying eyes. The kitchen yielded nothing unusual. The bedroom felt invasive to search, but I pressed on, driven by the growing conviction that her death deserved closer scrutiny. In the basement, among boxes of holiday decorations and forgotten keepsakes, I found what she'd hidden. Tucked inside an old Christmas tin, wrapped in tissue paper, was a collection of photographs and newspaper clippings. The images showed her house from various angles, clearly taken from across the street or from neighboring yards. Someone had been documenting her movements, her visitors, her daily patterns with the methodical patience of a predator. The newspaper clippings were even more disturbing. Articles about elderly residents who died alone, their deaths attributed to natural causes but occurring after periods of reported harassment or stalking. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Isolated individuals, usually women, who complained of being watched or followed in the weeks before their deaths. Authorities had found no evidence of foul play in any case. My aunt had drawn connections between these deaths, marking similarities in red ink, geographic proximity, similar complaints dismissed by police, the same general demographic. She'd been building a case, documenting what she believed was a predator who targeted vulnerable elderly people, terrorizing them until their hearts simply gave out from stress and fear. At the bottom of the tin was a manila envelope containing copies of police reports she'd filed, complaints about prowlers, about harassment, about feeling unsafe in her own home. Each report had been marked unfounded or unable to substantiate. The responding officers had been professional but dismissive, attributing her concerns to loneliness and an overactive imagination. I photographed everything with my phone, the camera flash illuminating details I might have missed in the dim basement light. The surveillance photos showed intimate knowledge of my aunt's routines. Someone had known when she gardened, when she collected her mail, when she left for grocery shopping. They'd studied her like a scientist observing a specimen. Back upstairs, I called the detective who'd handled her case. His voice was tired, professional courtesy masking impatience with what he clearly considered a waste of time. He reminded me that the coroner had found no evidence of foul play, that heart attacks were common among women her age, that grief sometimes makes family members search for explanations where none exist. But I pressed him to look at the evidence I'd found. The photographs, the journal entries, the pattern she'd identified in similar deaths. He agreed to meet me the following morning, though his tone suggested he was humoring a grieving relative rather than reopening a legitimate investigation. That night I stayed in my aunt's house. I told myself it was practical, that I needed to continue sorting through her belongings, but truthfully, I felt compelled to experience what she had experienced, to understand the fear that had consumed her final weeks. The house settled around me with creaks and sighs that seemed louder in the darkness. Every sound made me alert, every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. I found myself checking locks, peering through curtains, feeling the paranoia that had plagued my aunt seep into my own consciousness. Around midnight I heard it, footsteps on the front porch, slow and deliberate. The boards groaned under weight, then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The sound of someone testing the door handle made my heart race. I crept to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. A figure stood on the porch, barely visible in the darkness. Tall, wearing dark clothing, face obscured by shadow. They seemed to be listening, waiting. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they melted back into the night. I heard no footsteps departing, no car engine starting. They simply vanished. I spent the rest of the night awake, journal in hand, reading and rereading my aunt's accounts of similar visits. The pattern was always the same. Someone would approach the house in darkness, test doors and windows, then disappear, never breaking in, never leaving evidence, but making their presence known. Psychological warfare designed to erode peace of mind and sense of security. The detective arrived as promised, but his attitude changed when I showed him the evidence. The photographs were professional quality, taken with expensive equipment. The surveillance had been comprehensive, systematic. This wasn't the work of a casual peeping Tom or confused elderly neighbor. Someone had invested significant time and resources in monitoring my aunt. He took copies of everything, promising to look into the similar cases she'd identified. His manner had shifted from dismissive to genuinely concerned. The possibility that a serial predator had been operating undetected for years was too serious to ignore, even if the methods were unconventional and the evidence circumstantial. But as days passed, the investigation stalled. The photographs contained no identifying features of the person who'd taken them. The similar deaths my aunt had connected showed no physical evidence of foul play. The pattern she'd identified was compelling but not legally actionable. How do you prosecute someone for causing death by psychological torture when the victim's heart simply stopped beating? I continued living in her house, partly to assist with the investigation and partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that the predator might return. The journal had become my constant companion, its pages revealing new details with each reading. My aunt had been meticulous in her documentation, recording not just events but her emotional responses, her growing fear, her sense of being hunted. One entry particularly haunted me. She wrote about the smell of peaches appearing in her bedroom at night, so strong it woke her from sleep. She'd searched everywhere for the source, finding nothing, but the scent lingered, sweet and cloying like fruit left too long in summer heat. She'd begun to associate it with danger, with the presence of whoever was stalking her. I realized I'd been experiencing the same phenomenon. The peach scent that had led me to discover her journal had returned several times since, always in moments of quiet when I was absorbed in reading or lost in thought. It seemed to herald revelations, to guide me toward understanding, but understanding what? The answer came in another hidden cache, this one concealed behind a loose baseboard in the kitchen. More photographs, but these were different. They showed the interior of the house, rooms I recognized but taken from angles that suggested the photographer had been inside. Someone had violated her sanctuary, documenting her private spaces with the same methodical precision they'd used for exterior surveillance. The implications made my skin crawl. While my aunt slept or ran errands, someone had moved through her home like a ghost, recording evidence of their intrusion. They'd touched her belongings, breathed her air, violated every boundary of privacy and safety. The psychological impact must have been devastating. Among these interior photos was one that made my blood freeze. It showed my aunt sleeping in her bed, taken from the doorway of her bedroom. She looked peaceful, unaware of the presence, documenting her vulnerability. The timestamp indicated it had been taken just days before her death. I called the detective immediately. This was evidence of breaking and entering, of stalking, of behavior that clearly constituted criminal activity. But when he arrived to collect the new photos, his expression was grim. The investigation had hit legal roadblocks. Without physical evidence linking the surveillance to a specific individual, without proof that the psychological pressure had directly caused the deaths, prosecutors were reluctant to pursue charges. The pattern my aunt had identified was real, but proving intent was nearly impossible. The predator had chosen their methods carefully, staying just within the boundaries of legal ambiguity. They terrorized their victims through presence rather than action, through implication rather than direct threat. The resulting deaths appeared natural, stress-induced heart failure that could be attributed to age and health conditions rather than external pressure. I found myself caught in the same web of fear that had ensnared my aunt. Every sound in the night made me alert. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. The house that had once felt like sanctuary now felt like a trap, its walls closing in with the weight of accumulated dread. But I also felt something my aunt might not have experienced in her final weeks. I felt anger. Someone had murdered her as surely as if they'd used poison or a weapon, but they'd done it slowly, methodically, using her own mind as the instrument of destruction. They'd studied her vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical precision. The journal entries revealed how the psychological pressure had affected her physically. Sleepless nights, loss of appetite, chronic anxiety that manifested in chest pains and breathing difficulties. Her body had been under constant stress, her cardiovascular system strained to the breaking point. When her heart finally failed, it was the culmination of weeks of sustained terror. I began my own surveillance, watching from windows, documenting anyone who showed unusual interest in the house. The neighborhood was quiet, residential, the kind of place where people knew each other's routines and noticed strangers. But someone here had intimate knowledge of my aunt's habits, had been able to move freely without arousing suspicion. The answer came from an unexpected source. A neighbor, elderly like my aunt, approached me while I was checking the mailbox. She'd been watching me through her kitchen window, she said, worried about my staying alone in the house. She remembered my aunt's final weeks, how frightened she'd become, how she'd stopped her evening walks and begun keeping her curtains drawn. But she also remembered something else. A maintenance worker who'd been in the neighborhood for weeks before my aunt's death. He claimed to be checking utility lines, updating service records, ensuring everything was in working order. He'd been friendly, professional, asking residents about their schedules to avoid disrupting their routines while he worked. The description matched no utility company the neighbor had contacted to verify. The man had vanished shortly after my aunt's death, his work apparently complete. She'd thought nothing of it at the time, but now, hearing about the investigation, she wondered if his presence had been more sinister than it appeared. I shared this information with the detective, who began checking with utility companies and municipal services. No work orders had been issued for the neighborhood during that period, No maintenance had been scheduled or performed. The man had been an imposter, using his assumed authority to gather intelligence on potential victims. But even this revelation led nowhere concrete. The description was generic, the time frame vague. Without security cameras or detailed records, tracking down the false maintenance worker was nearly impossible. He could be anywhere, possibly already selecting his next target, beginning the patient process of psychological destruction that had claimed my aunt's life. The investigation officially closed without charges being filed. The evidence was compelling but circumstantial. The pattern was clear but legally insufficient. My aunt's death remained classified as natural causes, her fears dismissed as the paranoid imaginings of an isolated elderly woman. But I knew the truth. Someone had murdered her through sustained psychological torture, had studied her weaknesses and exploited them with methodical precision. They'd turned her own mind against her, using fear as a weapon more effective than any blade or poison. And they'd done it with such careful planning that the legal system couldn't touch them. I still live in her house sometimes, reading her journal, studying the photographs, trying to understand the mind capable of such calculated cruelty. The scent of peaches still appears occasionally, sweet and cloying, reminding me of discoveries yet to be made. I've become the keeper of her story, the witness to a crime that officially never happened. Sometimes I wonder if the predator knows I'm here, if they're watching me as they watched her. The thought should terrify me, but instead it fills me with grim satisfaction. Unlike my aunt, I'm not alone with my fears. I've documented everything, shared it with others, created a record that can't be dismissed or ignored. The truth has weight even when justice fails to materialize. My aunt's death wasn't natural, wasn't peaceful, wasn't the merciful end we'd all believed. It was murder, committed slowly and carefully by someone who understood that the most effective weapons are often invisible. Her story continues through me now, through her words preserved in that leather journal, through the evidence she so carefully collected. The predator may have escaped legal consequences, but they haven't escaped the truth. And truth, like the scent of overripe peaches, has a way of lingering long after we think it should fade. Story 8. It always seemed like a small ritual, one I never thought twice about. Every morning the newspaper would be left at my doorstep, folded precisely in 3, with the headline visible. It arrived at the same time without fail, as reliable as the sunrise. Last Monday, though, the fold was off only by a fraction, but enough to catch my eye. The next day, the headline was obscured by a crease. By Friday, the paper appeared upside down. Now I stand at the window every morning, wondering if tomorrow it will arrive at all. The delivery person wears a gray jacket. I know this because I've watched from behind the curtain more times than I care to admit. The shoulders are always hunched forward, the gait deliberate but unhurried. Sometimes I think I see a glance toward my window, but the distance makes certainty impossible. I found the first note tucked beneath the rubber band that holds the paper together. Just a slip of white paper, blank except for a single pencil mark a line, maybe an inch long. I almost threw it away. Almost. The coffee tastes different now. Not bitter, not stale, just different. I use the same beans, the same water, the same machine I've had for years. But something has shifted, like a frequency slightly off its proper channel. My neighbor mentioned seeing someone near my porch. She said it during casual conversation while we both checked our mailboxes. Her words felt rehearsed, though I can't explain why. The way she avoided eye contact, the slight pause before she spoke, or maybe I'm reading too much into ordinary awkwardness. The second note appeared 3 days later. This time the pencil mark was curved part of a circle, perhaps, or the beginning of a letter. I held it up to the light, searching for impressions or watermarks. Nothing, just that single, deliberate curve on otherwise pristine paper. I started keeping a log, not intentionally at first, just jotting down the time I retrieved the paper, the condition of the fold, any unusual details. The pattern that emerged disturbed me more than the initial irregularities had. The delivery person knows I'm watching. This certainty settled over me gradually, like dust on an unused surface. The pace of walking changed slower when passing my window, faster when moving away. The gray jacket began appearing at odd hours, not just during the morning routine. My sister called to check on me. We don't speak often, so the timing felt strange. She asked if everything was all right, if I'd been sleeping well. I couldn't remember mentioning any problems to her. When I asked what prompted her concern, she said I'd sounded different in my last message. I don't remember leaving any message. The third note contained a complete circle, perfectly round, drawn with the same pencil pressure as the previous marks. I traced it with my finger, wondering about the steadiness of the hand that created it. The paper felt slightly warm, though that could have been my imagination. I began varying my routine. Some mornings I retrieved the paper immediately after hearing it land on the porch. Other days I waited hours, watching through different windows to see if anyone returned to observe my habits. The delivery person's schedule never wavered, but my inconsistency seemed to introduce a new element of tension into our unspoken relationship. The woman at the grocery store asked if I was feeling all right. She mentioned that I'd seemed distracted lately, though I couldn't recall any recent interactions beyond the usual pleasantries during checkout. Her concern felt genuine but somehow misplaced, as if she knew something about my state of mind that I hadn't shared. I found myself checking the locks more frequently, not because I felt unsafe exactly, but because the simple act of turning the deadbolt provided a momentary sense of control. The metallic click became a punctuation mark in my daily routine, marking transitions between periods of observation and uneasy rest. The fourth note was different. Instead of a single mark, it contained what looked like the beginning of a word. 2 letters, maybe 3, written in that same careful pencil stroke. The handwriting seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen it before. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked tired, not just from lack of sleep, but from something deeper, a weariness that seemed to emanate from within. I found myself studying my own features, searching for signs of change I couldn't quite articulate. The delivery person stopped appearing in the gray jacket. Instead, I began noticing a blue windbreaker, then a dark coat, then clothing I couldn't clearly identify from my vantage point behind the curtain. The changes felt deliberate, like a slow reveal designed to keep me guessing. I started leaving the house at different times, taking routes I normally wouldn't choose. During these walks, I occasionally spotted someone who might have been the delivery person, but never close enough to be certain. The possibility of recognition hung in the air like humidity before a storm. The fifth note completed what the fourth had started, a word clearly written, soon. The letters matched the partial writing from before, confirming that these messages were building toward something specific. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I read it. My dreams became more vivid, filled with scenarios where I finally confronted the delivery person. In some versions, they removed their hood to reveal a face I recognized. In others, the confrontation never quite happened. I would wake just as the moment of revelation approached. The newspaper itself began changing. Articles seemed chosen specifically for my attention, headlines that echoed my growing paranoia. Stories about surveillance, about the thin line between observation and obsession, about ordinary people who discovered their lives weren't as private as they believed. I called the newspaper's circulation department. The representative assured me that their delivery service maintained strict professional standards, that any concerns about unusual behavior would be investigated promptly. But when I described the notes, the voice on the other end grew quiet, then suggested I might want to contact local authorities. The police officer who took my statement was polite but skeptical. She explained that without evidence of actual threats or illegal activity, there was little they could do about someone leaving notes with a newspaper delivery. Her suggestion to install a security camera felt both reasonable and somehow beside the point. I did install the camera, a small, discreet model that would record anyone approaching my front door. The first night's footage showed the usual delivery routine: a figure in dark clothing placing the paper on my porch with practiced efficiency. But their face remained hidden beneath a hood, and their movements seemed almost choreographed to avoid clear identification. The sixth note was longer, not quite a sentence, but more than the simple words that had come before. It read, "You understand now." The certainty in those words unsettled me more than any threat might have. Understanding implied a shared knowledge I wasn't conscious of possessing. I began questioning my own memory. Had I always been this observant of the newspaper delivery? Had the ritual of precise folding actually existed, or was it something I'd constructed retrospectively to explain my current fixation? The boundary between perception and invention felt increasingly unstable. My neighbor stopped mentioning the delivery person. When I brought up the subject during our next mailbox encounter, she claimed not to remember our previous conversation about someone being near my porch. Her confusion seemed genuine, which made it more disturbing than if she'd been deliberately evasive. The camera captured something different on the seventh night. The delivery person approached as usual, but instead of simply leaving the paper, they stood motionless for several minutes, facing directly toward the lens. Even with the hood up, I could sense they were looking straight into the camera, straight at me, watching from inside my house. I stopped reading the newspaper itself. The articles had become background noise to the real communication happening through those carefully placed notes. But I continued retrieving the paper each morning, driven by a compulsion I couldn't fully explain or resist. The eighth note contained my own handwriting. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand how words I'd apparently written could have appeared in a place I hadn't put them. The message was simple: I know what you're doing. But the familiarity of the script was undeniable, even though I had no memory of forming those letters. The delivery person was me. This realization arrived not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual acknowledgement of something I'd been avoiding. The camera footage, reviewed more carefully, showed my own movements, my own careful placement of papers and notes. The gray jacket hung in my closet. The precise folding was my own handiwork. But knowing this didn't explain why I'd been doing it, or why the knowledge had been hidden from my conscious mind. The notes I'd been leaving for myself suggested a purpose, a message I was trying to communicate across the gap in my own awareness. I found the journal hidden in a drawer I rarely opened. Pages of observations about my own routine, written in the same careful hand as the notes. Detailed records of my daily habits, my reactions to the changing newspaper presentations, my growing anxiety about being watched. I was both the observer and the observed, the hunter and the prey. The final note was already written, waiting in tomorrow's paper that I'd prepared and folded the night before. I could open it now, could read the conclusion to this strange correspondence with myself, but something held me back, a sense that the message was meant for the person I'd be tomorrow morning, not the one standing here now. Instead, I returned to the window, looking out at the empty street where soon I would walk in my gray jacket, carrying a newspaper folded with impossible precision, leaving messages for a version of myself who would read them with genuine surprise and growing unease. The morning light was just beginning to touch the horizon, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the soft thud of papers landing on porches throughout the neighborhood. Story 9. It always began with the creak of the floorboard, a familiar sound that whispered through the evening air just as the clock in the hallway struck 8. For months it was a comforting constant, a rhythm I scarcely noticed. But then I heard an echo where there should have been none, an extra step, or perhaps a hesitant pause. It happened again 2 nights later, only this time the sound lagged, mismatched with the clock's steady beat. Last night there were no footsteps at all, just a heavy silence that felt misplaced. Tomorrow perhaps the sound will return, but if it does, what will change next? The nausea comes first, always, a slow roll in my stomach that spreads upward like smoke, coating the inside of my throat with something metallic and wrong. I wake with it most mornings now, this persistent companion that settles behind my ribs and refuses to leave. The feeling has weight, density, as if I've swallowed stones while sleeping. I remember the kitchen counter, white tiles with thin gray lines that formed perfect squares. My fingers traced those lines while I waited, counting the intersections, following the grout until my eyes crossed. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar song, but the sound felt distant, muffled, as if heard through water. There was a cup, blue ceramic with a chip on the handle. The chip was shaped like a crescent moon, and I would run my thumb over it while drinking, feeling the rough edge catch against my skin. The cup sat on the counter for days afterward, unwashed, accumulating rings of dried coffee that looked like tree growth patterns. But which days the sequence blurs now, memories sliding against each other like wet photographs. The kitchen exists in my mind as a fixed point, unchanging, while everything around it shifts and rearranges itself according to rules I can't decipher. My hands shake sometimes when I'm not paying attention. Not a tremor exactly, but a subtle vibration that makes small objects seem to dance on surfaces. I notice it most when I'm holding paper, watching the edges flutter as if moved by an invisible breeze. The shaking stops the moment I focus on it, which makes me wonder if it's real or just another trick my body plays on my mind. The basement stairs were wooden, painted gray, with a handrail that wobbled when you gripped it too tightly. 13 steps down, I counted them obsessively, though sometimes I would reach the bottom and be certain I had only counted 12. The discrepancy bothered me more than it should have. Numbers should be reliable, constant, but even they seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. There was a smell down there, not unpleasant exactly, but heavy and organic, like damp earth mixed with something sweeter. Old fruit maybe, or flowers past their prime. The smell clung to my clothes afterward, following me upstairs, settling into fabric until I couldn't tell if I was carrying it with me or if it had simply become part of how I perceived the world. The light bulb hung from a cord, swaying slightly even when there was no breeze. I would watch it move in tiny circles, casting shadows that danced across the concrete walls. Sometimes the shadows seemed to move independently, separating themselves from their sources, but when I turned to look directly, everything would be still again. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looks different now. Not dramatically, not in ways I can point to and explain, but different nonetheless. The eyes seem set deeper, or perhaps the skin around them has changed color. My face appears longer somehow, as if gravity has been pulling at it while I sleep. I spend long minutes staring, trying to identify exactly what has shifted, but the changes slip away from direct observation like smoke. The phone rang once while I was in the shower. By the time I reached it, dripping water across the hardwood floor, the ringing had stopped. No message, no missed call indicator, as if the sound had been imagined. But I could still hear the echo of it bouncing off the bathroom tiles, a phantom sound that lingered longer than it should have. Water has a memory, I read somewhere. It retains the shape of whatever contained it long after being poured into something new. I think about this while watching coffee swirl in my cup, wondering what memories my morning drink carries, what invisible patterns it traces as it cools. The neighbor's dog used to bark every morning at exactly the same time, a reliable sound that marked the beginning of each day like a biological alarm clock. Then one morning, silence. I waited by the window, watching the empty yard, listening for a sound that never came. The absence felt louder than the barking ever had. I found myself counting things obsessively. Steps from the bedroom to the kitchen, tiles on the bathroom floor, books on the shelf. The numbers never stayed consistent, as if the house itself was expanding and contracting like a living thing, breathing in ways that defied measurement. Sleep comes in fragments now, broken pieces that don't quite fit together when assembled in memory. I dream of corridors that stretch longer than they should, of doors that open onto rooms I've never seen but somehow recognize. In these dreams, my footsteps echo with that same delay I heard in the hallway, as if the sound of my movement is struggling to catch up with my body. The basement again. I keep returning there in my thoughts, drawn by something I can't name. The concrete walls were painted white once, but moisture had caused the paint to peel in long strips that curled away from the surface like skin. I would pick at these strips while thinking, rolling them between my fingers until they crumbled into dust. There was a workbench against the far wall, its surface scarred by years of use. Tools hung from a pegboard above it, their shapes casting sharp shadows in the overhead light. Everything had its place, outlined in black marker on the board, but some of the tools were missing, leaving empty spaces that looked like absent teeth in a smile. The missing tools bothered me more than they should have, not because I needed them, but because their absence created a visual discord that my mind couldn't resolve. I would stare at the empty outlines, trying to remember what had hung there, but the memories slipped away like water through cupped hands. My appetite disappeared gradually, so slowly I didn't notice until my clothes began to hang loose. Food lost its appeal, becoming merely fuel that I consumed out of necessity rather than desire. Even favorite dishes tasted flat, as if someone had removed some essential ingredient that made them recognizable. The mailbox at the end of the driveway tilted slightly to the left. I noticed this one morning and couldn't stop thinking about it. The tilt was subtle, barely perceptible, but once seen it dominated my view of the entire front yard. I considered straightening it, but somehow never found the time, or perhaps I was afraid that fixing one thing would only reveal other imperfections I hadn't noticed yet. Time moved differently in the basement. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps hours compressed into minutes. I would descend the stairs intending to spend a few moments organizing, only to emerge and discover that the light outside had changed completely, shifting from morning brightness to afternoon shadow without my awareness. The washing machine sat in the corner, its white exterior yellowed with age. Sometimes I would hear it running when I knew it was empty, the familiar rhythm of wash and spin cycles echoing through the floor above. but when I went to investigate, it would be silent, its door standing open like a mouth waiting to be fed. Photographs began to look strange to me, not the subjects necessarily, but the way light fell across faces, the shadows that pooled in unexpected places. I found myself studying old pictures, searching for details I might have missed, but the harder I looked, the more alien the images became, as if I were viewing scenes from someone else's life. The floorboard that started everything was located just outside the bedroom door, positioned where anyone passing would naturally step. The wood was darker there, worn smooth by years of contact. I began to avoid that spot, stepping over it or walking around it, but the creak seemed to follow me, appearing in other locations throughout the house. My handwriting changed without my noticing. Not dramatically, but enough that notes I had written looked unfamiliar when I found them later. The letters seemed more angular, pressed deeper into the paper, as if I had been writing with greater force than usual. Sometimes I couldn't remember writing the notes at all, though they were clearly in my hand. The basement ceiling was lower than it appeared, causing me to duck instinctively even though I had never actually hit my head. This phantom sensation of impending contact made every visit feel claustrophobic, as if the space was gradually shrinking around me. I would find myself hunching over unnecessarily, protecting myself from an impact that never came. Dust accumulated in strange patterns throughout the house, not the random distribution you would expect, but organized lines and swirls that suggested deliberate arrangement. I would clean these patterns away, only to find them reformed in different locations, as if the dust itself was migrating according to some invisible map. The silence that replaced the familiar footsteps was not empty but full, pregnant with possibility and dread in equal measure. It pressed against my eardrums like atmospheric pressure, making me aware of my own heartbeat, my own breathing, sounds that had previously been background noise but now demanded attention. I started leaving lights on throughout the house, not because I was afraid of darkness, but because shadows behaved differently in the presence of multiple light sources. They became complex, layered, creating depth and dimension that single-source lighting couldn't achieve. These shadow landscapes became more interesting to me than the actual rooms they inhabited. The blue cup with the crescent chip disappeared one morning, not broken or thrown away, simply absent from its usual place beside the sink. I searched the entire house, opening cabinets I rarely used, checking spaces too small to hold a coffee cup, but it had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. My reflection in windows at night showed someone I almost recognized, a figure that moved when I moved but always seemed to be a fraction of a second behind, as if light itself was struggling to keep pace with reality. I began avoiding mirrors and reflective surfaces after dark, not from fear but from a growing uncertainty about which image was real. The basement workbench held secrets in its drawers, small compartments filled with items I couldn't identify. Screws that didn't match any standard size, pieces of metal bent into shapes that served no apparent purpose, fragments of things that might once have been whole, but now existed only as parts of some larger, unknowable puzzle. Sound traveled strangely through the house now, voices from the television seeming to originate from empty rooms, the refrigerator's hum echoing from the basement when the appliance was clearly in the kitchen. These audio displacements created a sense of the house as a living entity, breathing and speaking in frequencies just beyond normal perception. The missing footsteps left an absence that was more disturbing than their presence had ever been. I found myself listening for them compulsively, straining to hear sounds that weren't there, creating phantom rhythms from the settling of wood and the whisper of air through vents. The silence had become a presence unto itself, occupying space in ways that sound never could. My dreams began to bleed into waking hours, images and sensations persisting long after I had risen from bed. The boundary between sleep and consciousness became porous, allowing thoughts and fears to migrate freely between states. I would find myself responding to dream conversations while making breakfast or searching for dream objects in real rooms. The basement stairs creaked now in a different pattern, each step producing a unique note that together formed an atonal melody. I began to recognize this song, anticipating each sound before my foot made contact with the wood. The stairs were learning my rhythm, adapting to my presence in ways that felt both intimate and invasive. Temperature fluctuated without regard to weather or season, rooms becoming inexplicably cold or warm in defiance of the thermostat settings. I would enter spaces and feel the air shift around me, as if my presence was disturbing some delicate atmospheric balance that the house was constantly trying to maintain. The nausea that began each day now followed me through waking hours, a constant companion that colored every experience with its metallic presence. Food, conversation, even simple tasks became filtered through this persistent discomfort, until I began to wonder if the feeling was mine at all or something I had absorbed from the house itself. Objects moved when I wasn't looking, not dramatically but subtly, shifting position just enough to create doubt about their original placement. Books turned themselves spine inward, picture frames adjusted their angles, small items migrated from room to room according to logic I couldn't decipher. The house was rearranging itself around me, adapting to patterns I wasn't aware of creating. The floorboard's creak had become a metronome marking time in units I didn't understand. Even when no one walked across it, I could hear its voice in the settling of walls, the expansion of pipes, the whisper of air through gaps in windows. The sound had infected the entire structure, turning every surface into a potential source of that familiar wooden complaint. My hands remember things my mind has forgotten, moving automatically to touch surfaces, open drawers, trace patterns in dust. These unconscious gestures feel like muscle memory from activities I can't recall performing, as if my body has been living a parallel life that my consciousness wasn't invited to witness. The basement's smell has followed me upstairs, settling into furniture and clothing until I can no longer tell if I'm detecting an actual odor or simply remembering one. The scent has become part of my internal landscape, a sensory constant that colors every breath with its sweet, heavy presence. Light behaves differently now, bending around corners it shouldn't be able to navigate, creating illumination in spaces that should be dark. I find myself following these impossible light paths, trying to trace them back to their sources, but they always lead to empty rooms where no lamps are burning. The washing machine's phantom cycles have become more frequent, their rhythmic sounds providing a counterpoint to the missing footsteps above. I've learned to distinguish between real and imagined mechanical sounds, though the distinction seems less important now than it once did. Both types of sound serve the same function, filling silence with familiar patterns. Sleep, when it comes, brings dreams of the basement that feel more real than waking memories. In these dreams, the space is larger, extending beyond the house's foundation into territories that couldn't physically exist. I explore these impossible expanses, always searching for something I can't name but will recognize when found. The house breathes around me now, its rhythm matching mine until I can't tell where my pulse ends and its begins. We have become synchronized, this structure and I, locked in a dance of mutual adaptation that grows more complex with each passing day. The floorboard's creak has become our shared heartbeat, marking time in a language only we understand. Tomorrow, perhaps, the sound will return, but I know now that it never really left, only transformed itself into something deeper, more fundamental. The footsteps were just the beginning, the first note in a symphony that plays itself through every surface, every shadow, every breath of air that moves through rooms that have learned to listen. The basement waits below, patient as stone, holding its secrets in drawers and shadows, and the memory of tools whose outlines remain visible long after their substance has disappeared. I will return there, as I always do, drawn by questions that have no answers and answers that spawn new questions. The nausea rises again, familiar and constant, a tide that never fully recedes. It carries with it the taste of metal and the weight of stones, the accumulated mass of all the things I cannot quite remember and cannot quite forget. In this feeling, I find the only truth that remains constant, the certainty that something has changed, is changing, will continue to change in ways that defy understanding but demand acknowledgement. The clock in the hallway strikes 8, but there are no footsteps to accompany its chime. Only the echo of memory and the promise of sounds yet to come, waiting in the spaces between seconds, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence that has learned to speak. Story 10. The weight of silence. I was sitting on the 4th step, listening intently to the slow groan of the staircase. Each creak echoed far too long in the stillness, as if stretching to reach me. The dimness around seemed to press in, a watcher more than a veil. I knew where each sound belonged, each usual creak and shift, but this time there was an unfamiliar rhythm in the wood beneath me. I held my breath, waiting for it to resolve into something I'd understand. Nothing confirmed itself, the air remained thick, and only the steps seemed animated in their silence. Then, unexpectedly, I felt a vibration underneath, a second pulse where there should have been none. The house had been empty for weeks now. At least that's what everyone kept telling me. The police had finished their work, the family had collected what they needed, and the real estate agent had stopped returning calls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished, like a conversation cut short in the middle of an important word. I pressed my palm against the wooden step, feeling for that strange vibration again. The grain was smooth under my fingers, worn down by countless footsteps over the years. My neighbor had lived here for decades before she disappeared. I'd watched her climb these same stairs every evening, her hand trailing along the banister with familiar ease. Now the banister felt cold, almost hostile to my touch. The investigation had been brief, too brief if you asked me, though nobody seemed interested in my opinion. She was elderly, lived alone, had no close family nearby. When she didn't answer her door for several days, the mail carrier had grown concerned. The police found signs of a struggle in the living room, but no body, no blood, no definitive answers. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting after sitting on the hard wood for so long. The real estate agent had given me the key reluctantly, claiming I was helping to assess the property's condition. In truth, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way she'd wave from her kitchen window each morning, about the smell of cinnamon that would drift from her house on cold afternoons, about the strange phone call I'd received the night before she vanished. The living room still bore subtle signs of disruption. A lamp sat slightly askew on the side table. The corner of an area rug was folded over, creating a small triangle of exposed hardwood. Books on the shelf were pushed back unevenly, as if someone had run their hand along the spines while searching for something specific. The police had photographed everything, dusted for prints, taken statements from neighbors. Then they'd moved on to fresher cases, more promising leads. I walked to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing differently than they should in the empty space. The cabinets hung open, revealing neat rows of dishes and glasses. Everything appeared normal, domestic, peaceful. But there was something underneath that normalcy, something that made my skin crawl. The refrigerator hummed with mechanical persistence, the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. Opening the refrigerator door, I was hit with the smell of spoiled milk and rotting vegetables. The police had cleared out most perishables, but they'd missed a few items in the back. Behind a jar of pickles, I found a small notebook wrapped in plastic. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it, recognizing her careful handwriting on the cover. The pages were filled with observations, dates, license plate numbers. She'd been watching someone, tracking their movements with the methodical precision of a trained investigator. Names were replaced with initials, locations described in cryptic shorthand. But one entry stood out, written in darker ink, pressed harder into the paper. He knows I know. The calls are getting more frequent. I can't keep pretending everything is normal. My mouth went dry. She'd been afraid, genuinely terrified of someone. But who? And why hadn't she gone to the police? I flipped through more pages, finding detailed records of phone calls received at odd hours. Hang-ups, heavy breathing, whispered threats. The entries grew more frantic toward the end, her usually neat handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. The final entry was dated just 2 days before her disappearance. Saw him watching the house again. Same car, same position across the street. He's getting bolder. I need to tell someone, but who would believe me? The notebook slipped from my hands, hitting the linoleum floor with a sharp slap. The sound seemed to reverberate through the empty house, bouncing off walls and settling into corners like dust. I bent to retrieve it, and that's when I noticed the scratches on the kitchen floor. Thin lines gouged into the surface, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. Following the scratches with my eyes, I traced a path from the kitchen to the back door. The marks were subtle, easy to miss unless you were looking for them. The police investigation had focused on the front of the house, where neighbors reported seeing her last. They'd missed these signs entirely. The back door was locked, but the frame showed signs of forced entry. Tiny splinters of wood clung to the paint around the deadbolt. Someone had broken in or broken out. The distinction suddenly seemed crucial. I stepped outside into the small backyard, immediately hit by the smell of damp earth and decomposing leaves. The garden was overgrown, weeds choking out the carefully planted flowers she'd tended for years. But in one corner near the old oak tree, the soil looked different, darker, recently disturbed. My heart began to race as I approached the spot. The earth was soft, loose, as if it had been dug up and hastily refilled. I knelt down, brushing away leaves and debris. Underneath, the soil was definitely not settled naturally. Someone had been digging here. I needed tools. Back in the house, I found a small gardening spade in the utility closet. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle. Part of me wanted to call the police immediately, but another part needed to know what lay beneath that disturbed earth. The spade bit into the soft soil easily. 6 inches down, I hit something solid. Not rock, not root, something that didn't belong in a garden. I dug more carefully, brushing soil away with my fingers. The object was wrapped in plastic about the size of a shoebox. Inside the plastic was another notebook, this one filled with photographs and newspaper clippings. Pictures of young women, all with similar features, dark hair, slight builds, kind eyes. Underneath each photo were dates and locations, along with brief notes in unfamiliar handwriting. This wasn't her notebook. This belonged to someone else entirely. The newspaper clippings were from different areas, spanning several years. Missing persons reports, unsolved disappearances, bodies found in remote locations. All young women matching the same general description. All cases that had gone cold. My neighbor had stumbled onto something terrible. She discovered evidence of a serial predator, someone who'd been operating across multiple jurisdictions for years, and somehow he'd realized she was onto him. I sat back on my heels trying to process what I'd found. The careful documentation, the methodical tracking of victims, the geographic spread of the crimes. This wasn't the work of an amateur. This was someone organized, patient, intelligent, someone who'd managed to evade law enforcement for years. But how had she gotten hold of this evidence? And more importantly, where was she now? Standing up, I looked around the backyard with new eyes. The disturbed soil where I'd found the notebook wasn't the only irregularity. Near the back fence, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs, was another area where the ground looked uneven. My stomach clenched with dread as I realized what I might be looking at. The second site was larger, more carefully concealed. The earth here was harder, more settled, as if it had been undisturbed for longer. I began to dig, my movements frantic now, driven by a horrible certainty about what I would find. The spade struck something solid again, but this time it wasn't plastic. It was fabric, clothing. I stopped digging and sat back, my breathing rapid and shallow. I needed to call the police. This was beyond anything I could handle alone. But as I reached for my phone, I heard the sound that had brought me here in the first place. That strange vibration, that second pulse in the silence. It was coming from inside the house. Someone was there, someone was moving around inside, trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. My blood turned to ice as I realized I wasn't alone. The killer had returned, probably to retrieve the evidence I'd just uncovered. I crouched behind the oak tree, trying to make myself invisible. Through the kitchen window, I could see a shadow moving through the house. The figure was methodical, searching room by room, looking for something specific, looking for the notebook I'd found in the refrigerator. My phone was in my pocket, but I was afraid to make any sound that might alert the intruder to my presence. I watched as the shadow moved from room to room, growing more agitated with each empty-handed search. Furniture was being moved, drawers pulled out, papers scattered. Then the figure appeared at the back door. I pressed myself against the tree trunk, hardly daring to breathe. The person stepped outside, scanning the yard with practiced efficiency. Even in the dim light, I could see this was someone comfortable with darkness, someone who'd done this before. The figure moved directly to the spot where I'd been digging. They knelt down, examining the disturbed soil, the scattered earth, the evidence of my discovery. I heard a low curse, filled with frustration and rage. That's when I realized I recognized the voice. It belonged to someone I knew, someone I'd spoken with during the initial investigation, someone who'd had access to all the police reports, all the evidence, all the dead ends and cold leads. The detective assigned to her case had been the one hunting these women all along. He'd positioned himself perfectly to control each investigation, to misdirect resources, to ensure that no connections were ever made between the disappearances. My neighbor had somehow figured it out, and it had cost her everything. I watched in horror as he began to dig in the second location, the one I'd barely started to excavate. He worked quickly, efficiently, like someone accustomed to this grim task. Within minutes, he'd uncovered what I'd been afraid to find. She was there, wrapped in the same type of plastic as the evidence notebook. Even in death, her face held an expression of defiant determination. She'd fought back, had tried to expose him, had hidden evidence where she hoped someone would eventually find it. The detective stood up, brushing soil from his hands. He pulled out a phone and made a call, speaking in low, urgent tones. I caught fragments of the conversation. Situation contained, evidence secured, no loose ends. But there was a loose end, me. I was the witness he hadn't planned for, the variable that could unravel everything. I had to get away, had to reach other police, had to find someone who would believe what I discovered. I began to inch backward, moving as quietly as possible through the overgrown garden. Every step seemed impossibly loud, every breath a betrayal. The detective was still on the phone, but I could see him scanning the yard, alert to any movement. My foot caught on a root, sending me stumbling backward. The sound was small but distinct in the oppressive quiet. The detective's head snapped in my direction, and I saw his hand move to his weapon. I ran. There was no point in hiding anymore, no advantage to stealth. I crashed through the bushes at the back of the yard, scrambling over the fence into the neighboring property. Behind me, I could hear him giving chase, his footsteps heavy and determined. My house was 3 blocks away, but it might as well have been 3 miles. Every shadow could be hiding him, every sound could be his approach. I fumbled with my keys at the front door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the lock. Inside, I immediately called the state police, asking to speak with someone from internal affairs. The story poured out of me in a rush. The missing woman, the hidden evidence, the detective who was supposed to be investigating her disappearance. The person on the other end of the line listened with professional calm, asking for details, locations, specific names. But even as I spoke, I could see headlights pulling into my driveway. A car door slammed and heavy footsteps approached my front door. The detective had found me. The knock was polite, professional. His voice was calm when he called my name, asking me to open the door so we could talk. He sounded exactly like what he was supposed to be, a concerned law enforcement officer checking on a potential witness. I stayed on the line with internal affairs, whispering my address, begging them to send help immediately. The knocking grew more insistent, and I could hear him moving around the house, checking windows, looking for another way in. Then the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. I crept to the window, peering through the blinds, but his car was still in the driveway. He was out there somewhere, waiting, planning his next move. The internal affairs investigator assured me that units were on their way, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. A respected detective accused of serial murder by a neighbor with no law enforcement background. It sounded like the paranoid fantasy of someone who'd watched too many crime shows. But I had evidence, the notebooks, the photographs, the disturbed grave in the backyard, physical proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. All I had to do was survive long enough for someone to examine it. The power went out suddenly, plunging the house into complete darkness. He'd found the electrical box, cutting my connection to the outside world. My phone still had battery, but the cellular signal was weak. I was effectively isolated, exactly where he wanted me. I heard the back door open. He'd found a way in, probably picked the lock or broken a window I couldn't see. His footsteps were careful now, methodical. He was searching the house room by room, just as he'd done at hers. I hid in the bedroom closet, clutching my phone, praying that help would arrive in time. The footsteps grew closer, pausing outside the bedroom door. I could hear him breathing, could sense his presence just a few feet away. The closet door opened slowly. In the darkness, I could barely make out his silhouette, but I could feel his eyes scanning the space where I crouched among the hanging clothes. For a moment, we were both perfectly still, predator and prey frozen in a deadly tableau. Then I heard the sirens, multiple vehicles approaching fast. The cavalry had arrived, drawn by my desperate phone call and the evidence I described. The detective heard them too, and I felt his attention shift, his focus moving from me to his own escape. He backed away from the closet, and I heard him moving quickly through the house. By the time the police broke down my front door, he was gone, vanished into the night like the ghost he'd been for years, always one step ahead of justice. But this time was different. This time there was evidence, physical proof of his crimes documented in his own hand. The notebooks I'd found contained enough information to connect him to disappearances across multiple states. The investigation that followed would be massive, involving federal agencies and cold case units from dozens of jurisdictions. They found her body exactly where I'd indicated, along with evidence of at least 3 other victims buried in various locations around the property. The detective's house yielded even more evidence, trophies from his victims, detailed maps of hunting grounds, records of surveillance activities. But they never found him, despite a nationwide manhunt, despite his photograph on wanted posters across the country. He seemed to have vanished completely. Some investigators believed he'd fled to another country. Others thought he might have taken his own life rather than face capture. I knew better. Someone that careful, that methodical, that patient doesn't simply give up. He was out there somewhere, probably already establishing a new identity, a new hunting ground. The only question was whether he'd learned from his mistakes or if his arrogance would eventually lead to his downfall. The case officially remains open, though active investigation has slowed to a crawl. Occasionally, a disappearance in some distant location will match his pattern, and detectives will wonder if he started hunting again. But without concrete evidence, without witnesses, without the kind of breakthrough that had exposed him in the first place, he remains a shadow. I still live in the same house, though I've upgraded the security system and changed all the locks. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear that strange vibration again, that second pulse in the silence. But when I investigate, I find nothing. Just the ordinary sounds of a house settling, of wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes. The rational part of my mind knows he's probably thousands of miles away, focused on new victims in unfamiliar territory. But the part of me that lived through that night, that looked into the eyes of a killer and survived, knows that some hunts never truly end. Some predators never forget the prey that got away. I keep the evidence photos in a safe deposit box now, along with copies of all the police reports and witness statements. Insurance in case something happens to me, in case I become another unsolved disappearance, another cold case file gathering dust in some detective's cabinet. Because I know the truth that law enforcement doesn't want to acknowledge. He's still out there, still hunting, still killing. And someday when he feels safe enough, when he thinks enough time has passed, he might decide to tie up the loose end that I represent. Until then, I listen to the silence, waiting for vibrations that don't belong, for rhythms that shouldn't exist, waiting for the sound of footsteps that know exactly where they're going. The 4th step still creaks when I sit on it, but now I know the difference between the house settling and something more sinister. I've learned to distinguish between ordinary darkness and the kind that hides monsters. And in the deepest part of the night, when sleep won't come and every shadow seems to move, I wonder if she would be proud of what I accomplished. If she would think her sacrifice was worth the lives that were saved, the families that got closure, the truth that finally came to light. I think she would. I think she'd be satisfied knowing that her careful documentation, her methodical investigation, her refusal to let evil go unchallenged, had finally achieved justice for at least some of his victims. But justice and safety are different things. Justice is what happened to the case. Safety is what I'm still waiting for, still listening for, still hoping I'll recognize in time. The vibration in the fourth step was just the beginning. Everything that followed, everything that unraveled, started with that strange pulse in the silence. Sometimes the most important truths announce themselves quietly, with just the slightest disturbance in what we think we know about the world around us. I've learned to pay attention to those disturbances now, to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even if I can't immediately explain why. Because somewhere out there, in some other quiet neighborhood, another person might be sitting on their own fourth step, feeling vibrations that don't belong, hearing rhythms that shouldn't exist. And maybe if they're lucky, they'll listen.